Chapter 91, Chapter 88. The Arrival. Casterly Rock was on high alert. The simple fact that every raven within the fortress had disappeared 2 days earlier had already been enough for Kevin Lannister to know that something was about to go terribly wrong. He had spent all that time searching for those responsible, questioning maesters and flogging squires, yet he had failed to find a single feather anywhere in the rock, and it was driving him mad. Still, he had to keep his composure. Even after his brother's death, he needed to appear resolute, to project security and control, so that those waiting for his house to fall would see no opening, so that his family's legacy would not end buried in the mud. That unease became even more tangible when the first messengers arrived with news of the attack on Lannisport. There were only a handful of riders, the few who had managed to escape. And although Kevin did not know it, Vlad had simply allowed them to flee. He was shaken. An attack on Lannisport was already a tragedy in itself, but if it had merely been the work of greedy, foolish Ironborn, he could have organized a swift defense and driven them back. After all, the Ironborn had never been feared for their ability to fight on land. But what was approaching now made the Ironborn seem like nothing more than annoying neighbors. The Impaler. Just thinking about the man who inspired so many stories and legends sent a chill down his spine. He did not consider himself a superstitious man, but unlike his brother, who had perfected the art of concealing his emotions and keeping a cold, disciplined mind, Kevin had always been more ordinary. That was why the rumors circulating about Vlad Dracul only deepened the fear he inspired. And now the monster was at his gates. From the high fortified walls of Casterly Rock, Kevin watched as clouds of dust slowly rose in the distance, drawing ever closer across the plains surrounding the fortress. When he turned toward the coast, his gaze found an even more unsettling sight. The bay was crowded with black ships, each crowned with a prow that gleamed like the cold metal of a sword. Surrounded but not defeated, or so he firmly believed. He kept telling himself that the rock could withstand any siege. His brother had prepared it for that very purpose. Tywin had heard the rumors about Vlad, about a possible attack on King's Landing, and he had not fallen into the trap of focusing the defense on a single point. As always, he had been methodical. Before his premature death at the hands of his least favored son, Tywin had fortified the rock and ordered, in the king's name, that the same be done with all major coastal strongholds, Old Town, Storm's End, and above all, the Reach. Tywin had invested a great deal of his energy and the full weight of the Tyrell-Lannister alliance into hardening the breadbasket of the realm, from ditches meant to break cavalry charges to scorpions mounted atop the walls of Highgarden, in what he had mistakenly believed to be the best strategy against dragons. But despite all his meticulous preparation, there was something he had not accounted for. In fact, had someone pointed it out to him, he would probably have laughed in scorn. Tywin believed Vlad would be like any other lord. Arrogant, inflexible, proud, willing to do anything to elevate the name of his house. And precisely because of that, he had never anticipated a frontal assault on the rock. Vlad was not seeking prestige, nor did he wish to glorify his surname. If it were up to him, he would march straight to the wall and face the army of the dead on his own. But he could not. He lacked the men, the supplies, and the weapons required. Not even he, with all his power, would dare enter blindly into a magical domain ruled by an entity he knew far too little about. That was why he had sent a group of his progeny beyond the wall, to confirm the information he possessed, uncover anything new they might find, and, moreover, to capture whites as tangible proof that would make it easier to convince reluctant lords to ally with him. And above all, Vlad was a practical man. He had taken the Dothraki armies because it was the easiest path, and he conquered Slaver's Bay for the same reason: gold, armies, ships. He always sought the route that offered the least resistance. That was why Vlad would not attack the Reach. Though it would secure him control of the realm's food supply, it would also provoke every lord in Westeros to fight him to the death. Nor would he attack King's Landing, despite all the prestige it would bring him. He would attack the rock, because destroying it meant far more than a symbolic victory. It meant neutralizing the only fortress truly resistant to dragonfire. It meant stripping the Lannisters of their lair. And above all, it meant establishing an impregnable stronghold of his own, from which he could spread his shadow across Westeros without fear of ever lacking refuge. But Kevin did not know all of this. He only knew that the enemy was approaching, and to his misfortune, his brother, for once, might not have been as clever as he believed. As he watched the dust raised by the enemy army, his son Willem approached, clad in full armor and ready for battle. "Shall we order the gates closed, father?" he asked, his voice firm. "We must prepare for a siege." Kevin kept his gaze fixed on the horizon for a few seconds longer before turning to him. "There will be no siege," he said coldly. "I will not lock our men away like rats while that bastard roams our lands unchallenged. We will fight. We will meet him in the open field. And we will destroy him here and now." Willem blinked, surprised. "And if he uses magic? Or the dragons?" Kevin looked at him harshly. "If he has not used them yet, it is because he does not have them," he replied, a hint of disdain in his voice. "They are nothing but tales to frighten children." Willem nodded, his jaw tight, not daring to contradict him. Yet he could not help noticing that in his father's eyes, that statement was more hope than certainty. Soon after, the sound of horns echoed along the walls of the rock. The order had been given. One by one, the Lannister cavalry battalions began to pour out through the massive gates of the fortress. 10,000 men, all prepared to fight and win, their red and gold banners snapping in the wind, the thunder of hooves on dry earth beating out a deep, steady rhythm. Thousands of riders, lances raised, formed perfectly aligned ranks in the valley stretching before the rock. From the walls, archers took their positions with discipline, while the scorpions were drawn back and aimed toward the enemy. The dust on the far side of the field grew thicker, and before long, so did the figures emerging from those clouds of earth. Rider after rider, one after another, the Dothraki appeared like an endless tide, led by several horsemen in full black armor, crowned with cloaks as red as blood. And contrary to what one would expect of savage barbarians, they began to take up orderly, precise formations. Kevin watched them in silence, his brow furrowed. His gaze settled on the man at the head of the army. Tall, long blonde hair, pale skin. Even at a distance, he recognized the proud bearing of Vlad Drakel. He wore black scale armor and a crimson cloak that billowed in the wind alongside his mane and the banners of the Black Dragon. The Impaler had come in person, and here, on the plains of his home, they would fight for their lives and for the realm. Chapter 92, Chapter 89. False Valor. The air hung heavy over the plains of Casterly Rock, a gray, persistent mist blanketing the battlefield as the sun barely peeked out from behind the clouds, unable to pierce the haze, and the entire field lay in silence. Kevin Lannister adjusted his cloak over his shoulders and watched the horizon from one of the forward towers, with Willem, his eldest son, and Ser Forley Prester at his side, along with other trusted nobles. The Lannister army, disciplined and orderly, was fully deployed in a defensive line stretching across the hill, every step in front of the camp having been dug, reinforced, or seeded with traps. His brother's preparations, as always, had been meticulous, and Kevin himself had spent the previous week inspecting every line, every trench, every position of the scorpions mounted on the walls, making sure everything was in perfect condition, whether an attack came or not. Unfortunately, his paranoia was rewarded when, only a few days later, the enemy arrived, but at least he took comfort in knowing everything was ready to break them the moment they charged. "He underestimates us," Ser Forley remarked with a smile. "That monster from Essos thinks his horse-riding savages can defeat our armored soldiers. We'll teach him a lesson he won't forget." Kevin did not answer. Deep down, he wanted to believe the same, but anyone with sense knew that facing the Dothraki in open field was madness. Still, what choice did he have? If his first move were to wait out a siege, the men's morale would collapse. He could not allow that. His only option was to fight, inflict enough losses on the enemy, and then fall back into the fortress. War horns sounded in the distance, unmistakable proof that the attack had begun. Kevin even allowed himself a smile. The enemy was charging straight toward its own death. The Dothraki formed up in tight blocks, hurling war cries, yet they were neither scattered nor disordered. They rode powerful horses, each animal clad in black armor bearing the sigil of House Drakel on its flanks. Kevin was surprised by the organization of the charges, but he kept faith in the defenses. As he watched through his spyglass, especially the skies, he felt relief at seeing no flying figures. Whether the stories about Vlad were lies or the dragons were elsewhere hardly mattered. What mattered was that they were not there, not then. Suddenly, in the distance, through the mist covering the plains, he spotted a lone rider galloping toward the enemy's rear. When the rider halted beside Vlad, Kevin, watching through the spyglass, opened his eyes wide in recognition. "Is that?" Willem began, passing the spyglass to the others. It was Ser Barristan Selmy, mounted and upright, sword at his side. Kevin had met him on several occasions and had always held him in deep respect, though he had also been certain that Barristan was in the twilight of his life. After all, he was an old man. Yet the man riding now bore a face stripped of wrinkles, fatigue lines and sagging skin. His head showed shoulder-length dark hair streaked with silver. He no longer looked elderly, but like a man in his prime, perhaps in his 40s. As the Dothraki advanced, Kevin turned his gaze back to their leader. Vlad had not moved, remaining to the rear with his riders, his infantry and Ser Barristan. Calm, proud, and impassive. Kevin watched him closely, from more than half a league away, and still felt his legs tremble when Vlad returned his gaze. Their eyes meeting as if no distance existed at all. The Impaler Lord's enigmatic smile froze Kevin's blood. The first group of riders entered the trap zone. Pits opened, trenches swallowed men and horses, spikes tore through flesh. Some steeds reared up screaming, others rolled across the ground with shattered legs. Dozens fell, hundreds even, bodies and horses broken among pits and hidden stakes. Yet it was not enough. The traps were not close enough together, not designed to stop an army advancing with such precision, and because of that far fewer died than should have. At once the enemy formations spread out, bypassing and flanking the obstacles with ease. "Fire!" the general shouted from the field. Lannister archers took position in the rear and loosed a rain of arrows. Several struck true and men and horses fell. But instead of breaking, the Dothraki raised wooden shields, ready to absorb the volley. And with each man that fell, the rest gained another meter, never stopping, never faltering. And so the charge continued as if the riders feared no death. Soon they were upon the Lannister cavalry, which waited with leveled lances, still believing they could halt the tide. The riders clad in golden armor bearing the lion's crest spurred their mounts forward, lances aimed straight at the enemy. The thunder of hooves against the earth rising alongside the Dothraki war cries. The first Dothraki hurled themselves headlong into the clash, curved sabers raised, meeting the impact with near-suicidal ferocity. And then they collided. The Lannisters impaled several enemy riders with their long lances, bursting ribs and armor with a single blow. The screams of the wounded Dothraki filled the air, mingling with the hysterical whinnying of dying horses. Yet the charge did not slow. The riders from Essos, more agile and experienced, slipped between shattered lances, dodged incoming blows and, before the Lannisters could react, were already behind their lines, cutting down knights from the rear. Kevin watched through the spyglass as the golden ranks began to break apart. The Lannister cavalry, heavier and unable to turn with the speed of the Dothraki, was being slaughtered along with the knights trapped in the center. A Dothraki hurled himself from his mount in the middle of the charge, both blades raised, and split a knight's helm in two before he could even scream. The line broke, and then the Dothraki executed a maneuver, something unheard of to anyone familiar with their culture, yet there they were, organized and in formation. The lateral blocks of their cavalry opened like pincers and galloped in two wings, closing in on the Lannister infantry. The infantrymen raised their defensive spears as the riders approached, but the Dothraki moved in wide arcs, loosing volleys of arrows from horseback, shattering their ranks and, within minutes, cutting the left flank off from the center. A new horn sounded through the mist, and a third wave emerged from behind the enemy line. More riders, this time armed with axes and maces, who crashed into the exposed flanks of the soldiers struggling to regroup. The Lannister formation cracked like an egg. Men shouted orders and tried to restore order, but it was already too late. The center of the army was isolated, the left flank surrounded, and the right began to fall back under the pressure of the attacks. From atop the tower, Kevin could scarcely believe what he was seeing, as each new charge opened further gaps in his lines, breaking his men into ever smaller and more vulnerable groups, too scattered to hold any coherent formation. The Lannister banners still flew above the hill, but what remained of the left flank was retreating toward a line of wagons. The center fought encircled, and the right struggled to regroup as the Dothraki charged again with fury. And Vlad, from his hill, had still not moved. "To the fortress!" Kevin shouted, his voice heavy with frustration. "Fall back inside the walls. Sound the retreat." Lannister trumpets blared and the banners began to withdraw uphill as the remnants of the army fell back in disorder. Wounded knights, infantry without shields, entire squads running beneath the blare of horns, while archers on the towers covered the retreat by firing at the flanks and the iron gates began to open to receive their own. Kevin clenched his teeth, his knuckles white against the parapet. Being defeated in his first battle was not a good omen. He watched as, little by little, his men reached safety and, even so, he frowned, having expected to see the Dothraki at their heels, hunting down stragglers and finishing off the wounded. But that did not happen. All the Essosi cavalry halted at once, as if stopped by a silent command, and then, with unsettling discipline, Dozens of rider lines regrouped swiftly, turned about, and returned to their positions alongside the main body of the army. They pursued no one. Kevin's men descended the slope covered in blood and mud, unable to understand why they were being allowed to escape. Some looked back in disbelief, others wept with sheer relief as they crossed the gates, which closed behind them with a dull thud. "Why aren't they following us?" Willem asked. "Why are they stopping?" Ser Forley Prester, still at his side, answered with evident uncertainty. "Perhaps Vlad intends to begin a siege. Starve us out." He did not finish the sentence. At that very moment, Vlad Drakul dismounted from his horse and, with a calm gesture, handed the reins to one of his riders before beginning to walk alone across the field, carrying only his sheathed sword, without helm or shield. He walked as if strolling through a garden, while the mist swirled around him as though avoiding him, and his cloak trailed behind, red as the blood staining the fields. Kevin did not move, not even blinking, watching in paralysis as that man crossed the ground with steady steps and a stony expression, indifferent to the chaos around him. Even the soldiers posted along the battlements remained motionless, petrified by the sight, as Vlad advanced, step by step. The silence shattered abruptly when Kevin finally reacted and shouted at the top of his lungs. "What in the seven hells are you waiting for? He's in range. Shoot! Fire!" He did not understand what was happening or why Vlad exposed himself so brazenly, but he could not waste the opportunity. The first arrows cut through the air. More than 100 projectiles were loosed at once, all aimed at the same target, but Vlad, without even attempting to move aside, placed a hand on the pommel of his sword, its blade beginning to glow with a deep red hue, and with impossible speed deflected, one after another, the arrows that might have struck him. The rest embedded themselves in the surrounding ground, forming a perfect circle without a single one touching him. That was enough for Kevin to order a second volley, more out of instinct than courage or strategy. Another rain of arrows rose from the fortress walls, and, this time, Vlad did not even pause. He kept walking, deflecting projectile after projectile with quick, almost casual movements, not one grazing him or drawing the slightest sign of effort. Step by step, he closed the distance until he stood only a few meters from the Rock's Gate. Kevin no longer knew what to think. He could not understand how Vlad was doing it, or why, and that inability to comprehend only made the cold spread through his blood. Fear of the unknown, fear of the Impaler Lord. It was then that Vlad stopped, as if he were simply strolling through a forest, and with a gesture, a single gesture, he condemned Casterly Rock. He raised his hand. The main gate began to tremble, metal shrieking with a guttural sound as the iron plates bowed outward and the wood splintered with a dry crack. But the worst came after, with the heat. A searing heat seeped through the cracks in the walls, as if a dragon were breathing from the other side. The metal roared and turned red, then orange. The stone itself seemed to ignite and, from the gate, a black smoke poured out, thick as tar and so hot that the men close enough to breathe it fell dead on the spot, their faces twisted in agony. The hinges burst and, with them, the solid oak split from the center of the iron-bound door. Little by little, the metal, now red as fire, began to turn white, so bright it was like staring at the sun, and to the horror of all who witnessed that grotesque spectacle, the gate began to warp, to sag under its own weight, turning liquid as if it were candle wax. Inch by inch, unmistakable, inevitable. Kevin could only stare, his throat dry, as the last defense of Casterly Rock became a pool of molten metal at Vlad's feet, while the white-hot iron spread across the stone, burning everything and everyone in its path. Then they all heard it. Calm footsteps, with the wet sound of someone walking through a puddle, though beneath his feet there was no water, only molten iron. The steps drew closer and closer until Vlad Drakul crossed the threshold of what had once been the gate of Casterly Rock. He walked over the blazing metal and his clothes remained immaculate, his posture upright, without the slightest sign of effort. That supernatural perfection made terror become tangible. As if time itself had stopped to watch him cross the gates the Lannisters had considered unassailable for centuries. Willem Lannister took a step back, his face white as marble. "By the seven," he whispered, his voice breaking. Kevin clenched his fists. He wanted to give an order, any order, but no words came. And then everything fell apart, like dominoes toppling one after another. A soldier dropped his sword and fled with a scream of pure terror. In the lower courtyards, dozens began throwing down their weapons. Some ran toward the tunnels and others fell to their knees, eyes lowered. The Unsullied crossed the melted gate seconds later, following a simple gesture from Vlad that seemed to cool the iron, as if the world itself obeyed his command. They marched in silent ranks. Then came the soldiers in black armor, the Blood Riders, and beyond them the Dothraki, who dismounted to take the fortress without firing a single arrow more. In the highest tower, the lion banner was torn down and, in its place, a red flag rose, bearing a black dragon and a sun pierced through its center by a sword. The Impaler Lord had arrived in Westeros. Chapter 93 Chapter 90 Dragon Among Serpents. Sunspear, 15 days before Vlad's arrival in Westeros. In the days following her arrival, Daenerys remained in Sunspear without drawing too much attention, partly because her stay had to remain secret and partly because parading among Dornish nobles felt more like a punishment than a privilege. She spent her mornings training with a sword in the inner courtyards, and since her awakening, as she liked to call it, fighting had become more stimulating than any courtly game. It did not match the euphoria of riding her dragon, but wielding her Valyrian sword Trueblood gave her a different kind of satisfaction, the certainty of being stronger and faster than any ordinary man. In the afternoons, she studied the book of pyromancy Vlad had left her. The content was dense and dangerous, and, although she still could not channel fire with precision, she could feel her progress, the energy pulsing within her. The servants watched her discreetly, some even spied on her openly, and it was evident that Doran Martell distrusted her, even though his pain had lessened since she offered him that small vial. One morning, one of the guards informed her that the prince was waiting in one of the inner chambers, and Daenerys did not take long to present herself. She walked through the stone corridors with confidence, her silver hair tied back with a simple ribbon and her expression calm. Doran awaited her seated, surrounded by documents. "Good day, princess," he greeted courteously. "I hope your stay in Sunspear has been a pleasant one." Daenerys did not miss that the Prince of Dorne refused to call her your grace, but she would not make an issue of it. Not yet, he was not her brother. "As pleasant as can be expected, Prince Doran," she said with a faint, slanted smile, "though I must say it has been more hospitable than some of your vassals anticipated." Doran understood exactly what she meant. "Ser Aaron was disrespectful. For that I offer my apologies," Doran noted in a conciliatory tone. "I have already reminded him of his place. I am used to men underestimating me," she remarked with an ironic smile. "Curiously, it rarely ends well for them." Doran took a cup, drank slowly, and continued. "I am grateful for the cure you gave me. It has eased my pain and allowed me to walk for the first time in years," he added sincerely. "Something no maester I consulted could achieve, and they certainly did not approve of me drinking something born of the so-called higher mysteries without consulting them." Daenerys smiled with quiet satisfaction before replying. "For centuries, Westeros has despised the power of magic, dismissing it as tales or dark rituals, but my husband has awakened that power," she continued with pride. "He has made it measurable and teachable, like any discipline of the Citadel, and that is our advantage." Doran did not look convinced. "Your husband is an enigma," he observed in a serious tone. "He came from nowhere and now sets his sights on Westeros. I do not know whether he does so out of ambition or for you." Daenerys laughed, a sincere, musical sound. "I assure you it is for me. If it were up to him, he would have spent the rest of his life in some corner of Essos, built himself a quiet castle and never thought of the throne even once," she replied, casting him an almost complicit glance. "He calls it a monstrosity of iron." Doran allowed himself a small shake of the head, unconvinced. "And yet, here you are," Doran insisted, "asking for Dorne's support to place upon the throne a house that is not of Westeros. House Targaryen will not vanish if its fate concerns you so much," she answered calmly, "but my children will bear his name. It is the least I can do for him. I will not place a name above my blood." "Then you seek war," Doran concluded gravely. "Do not be melodramatic. Anyone with sense knows the only way to reclaim the throne is war. The difference will be the scale and the number of lives lost." Daenerys replied without losing her composure, "Your own pursuit of justice would have ended the same way, Prince Doran." "There are other ways to obtain justice," Doran murmured. Daenerys looked at him as if he were a fool. "Like that boy who claims to be Rhaegar's son?" she asked with a cold smile. Doran blinked, surprised, but she dismissed the matter with a small gesture of her hand. "I have known for years. I know who he is, or rather what he is not." "He is not Rhaegar's son," she added, shrugging with an almost insulting calm. "He is a descendant of Blackfyre, raised by the spider to be the king the Targaryens never were. A noble idea, I admit, but still a false one." Doran watched her in silence. Truth be told, he had not had many interactions with the supposed son of Rhaegar and had limited himself to maintaining contact with Varys, who spoke of how he had saved the boy all those years ago, and though skeptical, Doran wanted to believe it was true. And even if he advanced, she continued, even if he convinced half of Westeros, the Lannisters would not remain idle. A spark glimmered in her eyes. Soon you will discover why your only option is us. She added softly. Take care of your family, Prince, after all, it is the most important thing we have. The warning, more than intimidating Doran, made it clear that Daenerys possessed privileged information, something that did not surprise him, considering Vlad's spies had reached his own office before his men even noticed. Even so, when he thought of his brother in King's Landing, he knew the warning was most likely meant for him, and he decided that, as soon as Daenerys left the chamber, he would order all available information about the situation in the capital to be gathered. Before he could inquire further, a new presence made itself known. Arianne Martell appeared in the doorway, smiling politely, clad in an orange dress that clung to her curves, her hair framing her face. Forgive the interruption, Father Princess, she commented, emphasizing the word princess. If you have finished here, I wish to invite Princess Daenerys to breakfast with me and my dear friend Myrcella. There was sweetness in the invitation, but her heart beat fast, and Daenerys simply watched her intently, curious about whatever she had planned. Princess, you have given me much to consider, Doran admitted, rising. Please enjoy the morning with my daughter. I will give you a final answer tonight. Of course, she nodded, rising with a smile as she looked directly at the Princess of Dorne. It will be a pleasure. Daenerys left Doran's chamber and walked beside Arianne, who moved ahead with her back straight, escorted by 2 Dornish handmaidens. It's a beautiful day today, Princess. It will be a splendid breakfast, Arianne said, turning with a smile. I'm sure it will, Daenerys replied, just as they reached the garden doors. The hanging gardens of Sunspear seemed untouched by the desert. Beneath pergolas covered in flowers, the air was thick with sweet scents, while the fountains murmured softly over marble basins. Near one of them, a square table had been arranged, with linen cloths and plates of fresh fruit, aged cheeses and pastries. Myrcella was already there, standing beside a rosebush, breathing in its fragrance with her eyes half closed and a serene expression. At barely 14, she still looked like a child, dressed in golden and pink silks, her gestures gentle. Princess, Your Grace, she greeted with a perfect curtsy, the only one to use the title correctly. You look radiant today, Your Majesty. Daenerys smiled at her as Arianne stepped to her side. And you have blossomed splendidly, she remarked kindly. I would say you grow more beautiful each day. Myrcella lowered her gaze, blushing, her fingers idly playing with a petal as if unsure what to do with them. I've caught my brother Trystane looking at her more than once. Arianne cut in with a light laugh. It seems you won't be the only one blooming here, dear. Myrcella flushed even more and looked away, while Arianne watched her with a half-smile. When they all took their seats, the servants served in silence. The scent of fresh bread mingled with that of cut fruit and, after a brief toast to peace, breakfast passed without incident. They spoke of the weather and harmless gossip, and Arianne even made a playful remark about the attractiveness of one of Daenerys's men. I've heard the pyramids of Meereen are so tall they touch the sky, Myrcella said dreamily. One day I would like to see them with my own eyes. I promise I'll show them to you someday, Daenerys said without thinking much of it. We'll have time once you come with me. And I would be delighted to join you, Arianne added naturally. Daenerys did not miss her effort to remain the center of the conversation. I imagine it cannot be easy for your husband to rule a city like Meereen, the Princess of Dorne remarked with a barely concealed hint of distaste, with all those Dothraki enslavers roaming freely. Daenerys was about to roll her eyes at the provocation, but she did not grant her that satisfaction. My husband has little patience for politics, she replied softly. I usually take charge of governing the cities we conquer, while he handles the army and defense. Like the perfect team, Myrcella exclaimed, sighing in admiration. You are made for each other. Of course, Arianne added, nodding with a certain stiffness. The conversation drifted toward Dothraki customs, Meereen, and the cities Daenerys had visited across the narrow sea, and Myrcella asked questions with curiosity. And how much longer will you remain in Sunspear? Arianne asked, wiping her lips with an embroidered napkin. We will depart in a few days. I'm afraid time is pressing. Daenerys replied with a smile. Our fleet will arrive in Westeros at any moment. A brief silence followed. Daenerys did not need to look up to notice the brush of leather against stone, the creak of boots on the ground, and the heartbeats of men who were slowly surrounding the gardens. Even so, she said nothing. She simply picked up a strawberry, bit into it calmly, and smiled again. Chapter 94, Chapter 91. Make them bleed. Arian picked up a grape, rolled it between her fingers, and brought it to her lips with a self-satisfied smile. Sunspear is enormous. Danny? I may call you Danny, yes? She continued without waiting for an answer. You have barely seen the gardens and the castle. You should stay a while longer. Daenerys did not change her expression. She kept her gaze fixed on the cup and gently shook her head. Impossible, she remarked calmly. The campaign will begin soon, and every day counts. The crunch of footsteps interrupted the conversation, and from the shadows emerged a tall man dressed entirely in black. Gerald Dane, or Darkstar as he was known, stepped forward without greeting or bowing. His dark hair falling to his shoulders and framing a defiant smile and violet eyes that scrutinized Daenerys with brazen interest. The bastard of House Dane was technically a knight, but no one regarded him as such. He was arrogant, narcissistic, and ruthless, behaving as though he stood above any noble, a dangerous and intelligent man whom, under other circumstances, Vlad would have recruited without hesitation. Arian rose naturally and took the man's arm, leaning against him as though they had been lovers for years. Unfortunately, Danny, she said with false sweetness, your stay in Sunspear will be extended indefinitely. Do not attempt to call your men. I have sent mine to relieve them of their duties. That was when the soldiers Daenerys had already sensed began to appear. 25 men approached without adopting a combat stance. After all, they had only come for a princess, and so the circle closed calmly. Arianne did not even attempt to hide her satisfaction. Daenerys did not respond at once. Her expression did not change. She merely arched a brow with irony, thinking that at last her blood riders would be able to drink their fill. I hope they were not important soldiers, she said softly, wiping her fingers with a napkin, because they will not return. Myrcella pretended to shrink into herself, as though terrified. So this was your plan, Daenerys remarked, to take me hostage? Arianne lifted her chin proudly, as if she had devised an infallible scheme. Did you truly think you would impose yourselves upon Dorne so easily? She shot back, raising her voice slightly. My men will now escort you to more private chambers. I beg you not to resist, or they may be more forceful. Daenerys looked at her for a moment, not with the indignation or fear Arianne expected, but with the expression of a teacher faced with a particularly foolish question. Without arguing, she set down her cup and rose with elegance. I am not impressed, she said without raising her voice. Arianne stared at her. She could not understand how she could remain so calm in a situation where she was clearly outmatched, but she did not care about her reasons. To her, the game was already won. Please, your grace. She used the title with evident irony. Show some composure and accept your loss with dignity. Daenerys did not answer and continued to observe her with the same expression one might reserve for a dull lecture. Arianne pressed her lips together. That calm was unbearable. It was neither fear nor haughtiness, not even pride. It was pure disdain, and it made her rise with almost childish anger, raising her voice without thinking. Seize her, she ordered with a sharp gesture and a cruel smile. And be careful with her dress. It is the sort that tears at the slightest touch. A poorly concealed laugh escaped one of the soldiers at the Princess of Dorne's insinuation. He was a dark-haired man with a broad face and crooked teeth who stepped forward first, licking his lips with an unpleasant grin as he reached toward Daenerys, his eyes shining with excitement. He never touched her. Daenerys moved swiftly. Her hand closed around the man's wrist and, with a sharp twist, the bone cracked as it broke at an unnatural angle. The soldier's scream tore through the air as he writhed like an animal. Before the others could react, Daenerys had already torn the sword from his belt with her other hand and, with a turn, slit his throat from side to side. Blood gushed in torrents, soaking the floor and the queen's dress, but she merely released the body, which collapsed with a dull thud. Daenerys never took her eyes off Arianne. She looked directly into her eyes as she killed the man and smiled. Even Darkstar remained motionless. He had watched the scene with interest, but not even he had expected such a clean and brutal murder. He had anticipated a frightened girl, not a cold and ruthless warrior. Daenerys lowered her gaze to her hands and pressed her lips together in distaste, not at the blood itself but at its origin, because the idea of drinking from that man repulsed her, like tasting sour ale after fine wine. So she wiped her face with her thumb, collecting a drop of blood from her cheek in a slow, almost refined gesture, careful that it did not touch her lips. There was a second of absolute silence, broken only by the breeze and the faint dripping of blood still falling from the sword's tip. And then, as if someone had given a signal, 3 men lunged at her at once. Daenerys moved like a blur. She spun with precision, her blade describing a clean arc that cut the first soldier's throat while piercing the second's abdomen. The third managed to block the strike, but Daenerys shoved him, sending him flying as if he were a rag doll, and his body struck a stone column with a dry crack before falling to the ground without moving. Daenerys clicked her tongue, annoyed. She had not intended to use so much force. Aerion watched the scene in horror. The confidence had vanished from her face and been replaced by a pallor that could rival that of any vampire. Myrcella, meanwhile, sheltered behind the Princess of Dorne, looked at Daenerys with astonishment, and with eyes gleaming with greed. When another soldier came from the flank with a raised spear, Daenerys turned and drove a punch straight into his chest. The impact was sharp and, an instant later, wet, as her arm pierced flesh, ribs, and lung, becoming lodged inside. She frowned as she yanked it free, lifting the body as though it weighed nothing, and dropped it at her feet with evident disgust. That delay cost her dearly. A fourth man came from behind and swung his sword at neck height, but Daenerys reacted in time and her body dissolved into a dark mist that scattered into the air, only to reappear an instant later several paces away, her violet eyes blazing with fury. It was her first real battle and, during her training sessions with Ser Barristan, they had done nothing but praise her talent and skill, so she had felt confident, certain she could face any human opponent without resorting to her supernatural gifts. However, from the moment the fight began, she had made foolish mistakes, one after another. The soldier turned, bewildered, but she was already upon him, driving a swift thrust that entered through his right eye and exited the back of his skull. The body fell to its knees and then collapsed onto its side. A shout rose among the guards. "It's a monster!" One of them, trembling, dropped his weapon and ran toward the garden corridors, but he did not get far. Daenerys lunged after him like a blur, propelling herself forward, and her sword pierced the man. However, instead of embedding itself in the wall as she expected, the blade splintered in her hands. Daenerys sighed, resigned. This battle had not been the epic display of skill she had imagined recounting to Vlad, and she could already anticipate his remarks about performance issues. Pushing those thoughts aside, she forced herself to pause for a second, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath, regaining her focus, then picked up another sword from the ground and lifted her gaze toward the remaining soldiers. Some were no longer shouting orders or advancing, but stumbling backward with lowered weapons, staring in disbelief at the mangled bodies at their feet. One even dropped his sword and fled without looking back. Daenerys did not follow him with her eyes. She simply pivoted and slit the throat of another who still hesitated, while the rest faltered, forming a trembling semicircle. Then, without warning or word, Gerald Dane attacked her from behind. Only years of discipline had kept him from doing so sooner. He had watched her move with that impossible strength, swift and brutal as a beast, but he could not continue watching her slaughter his men, not if he intended to survive. At the beginning, the plan had been simple. Surround her, corner her, and with Arion's confident smile the men advanced while he felt secure, even euphoric, convinced that a few seconds, a couple of cuts, and a handful of screams would be enough to have the Dragon Princess at his mercy. Even with the rumors about her skill with a blade, Gerald trusted he could defeat any woman, however skilled she might be. But Daenerys did not fight like a woman. Each of her blows was lethal and her movements were faster than anything he had ever seen. She even seemed capable of becoming intangible for an instant, evading strikes that should have reached her. Gerald understood, too late, that all the assumptions sustaining his arrogance were useless, and his mind wavered between greed to uncover the secret of that strength and the certainty that, if he did not kill her in that very moment, she would kill him. So he lunged when he thought she was distracted, his blade seeking her back with lethal precision, but it never touched her. Daenerys spun at an impossible speed and blocked the attack, catching his blade with hers, and their gazes met for the first time. Violet eyes, serious, shining with an unnatural light. Gerald pressed forward again, stamping hard and shoving her with the intent of throwing her off balance. But she pivoted around him as if in a dance step and launched a direct slash at his neck. Gerald reacted on pure instinct, twisting his wrist and managing to intercept the blow, deflecting it along the edge of his blade. The impact was so violent that Daenerys' sword bent abruptly, taking her by surprise, and without losing rhythm Gerald shifted to a two-handed grip and delivered a brutal cut to her side, almost allowing himself to smile as he imagined her split in two. The smile vanished instantly. Daenerys also leapt back, alarmed, bringing her hand to her hip where she had felt the impact, but she found only the long line of torn fabric in her dress, which had long since ceased to be white and was now covered in blood and dust. Both remained motionless. She, because for an instant she had been outmatched by an ordinary person. He, because he had just discovered with horror that his sword was incapable of piercing the skin of the thing before him. Because, for Gerald Dane, there was no longer any doubt. The creature standing before him was not a woman at all. Chapter 95, Chapter 92. Being reasonable. Gerald Darkstar stepped back, gasping, gripped by panic, because despite all his experience and the cruelty he had so often inflicted upon others, he was still only a man, very skilled, yes, but a man nonetheless. And like any man, he feared what he did not understand, especially the creature standing before him, who still retained the appearance of a beautiful woman. Daenerys, for her part, touched her side again where Darkstar's sword had torn her dress. It had not harmed her at all, but for an instant she had been outmatched by an ordinary man. Even after months of training and combat against seasoned warriors, she had allowed a common man to catch her by surprise. The embrace and its supernatural abilities had made her confident, arrogant, like her brother, and she could feel nothing but shame for it. However, she was not one to remain trapped in self-pity, and quickly understood the cause of her defeat, and acted accordingly. She would not underestimate her opponent again, nor would she continue with games and tests. She would end it immediately. Daenerys lunged at him with a movement so fast that it took Darkstar completely by surprise. She seized him by the throat and slammed him against a nearby wall. The impact tore a muffled grunt from him and made him spit blood, while the sword slipped from his hands and struck the ground. The bastard of House Dane tried to free himself with all his strength, but the pressure on his neck was like an iron vice. Daenerys turned her hip and, with a swift movement of her sword, separated Gerald's head from his neck. It fell to the ground with a look still full of fear and surprise. The silence that followed lasted only an instant and was broken by a distant roar, deep and threatening, that froze the blood of everyone present. It was a sound so primitive that it awakened immediate fear, and the few soldiers who still remained alive looked at one another before fleeing in haste. Arianne Martell remained motionless, stunned. She could not understand how that slight and seemingly fragile woman possessed a power that existed only in stories and legends, nor how it was possible that she did not have a single scratch. What confused her most was that her own body would not respond. Fear had paralyzed her and she could not move a single muscle. She tried to bite her lip and force her legs to react, but she was frozen in place. Even so, she kept Myrcella behind her, protecting her instinctively. She could not risk her claim to the throne or everything would have been in vain. Then, to her relief, she heard the metallic sound of boots approaching rapidly. Doran Martell appeared fully armored. Flanked by a retinue of 60 guards, he had gathered anticipating a possible attack, but nothing had prepared him for what he found. The scene was grotesque. Dismembered bodies lay across the stone and pools of blood soaked every corner of the garden. He advanced slowly, cautiously, and could not help frowning as he recognized some faces among the dead. Veterans of his guard and men he suspected had joined Arianne's faction. His gaze settled on Daenerys, who stood upright in the middle of the massacre, her dress torn and splattered with blood, her arms completely covered in red and her violet eyes shining with an unnatural light. As he drew closer, he distinguished the cracked wall where Darkstar lay dead, the bodies of at least 15 men, and his daughter, with her back against a fountain, shielding Myrcella with her own body. Daenerys slowly turned her head toward him, her gaze fixed and without a trace of fear, and the contrast between her bearing and the chaos surrounding her sent a chill down his spine. Arianne, still pale and rigid, barely managed to speak. "Why, you must kill her," she stammered, "or she will kill us all." Doran frowned, concerned, but chose to ignore his daughter's warning and addressed the last Targaryen directly. "What has happened, Daenerys?" he asked in a stern tone, trying to take control of the situation. "Do you dare kill my men in my own castle?" He did not get to hear an answer. A deep and savage roar thundered over the hanging gardens, so powerful that it made the water in the fountains tremble and shook the bones of everyone present. The sunlight vanished at once, replaced by an immense shadow that covered every corner of the fortress. The trembling of the ground announced the arrival of Balerion, a colossal creature, with black scales thick as plates of steel and bone spurs protruding from its joints. The dragon observed those present before raising its head and releasing an ancient, deep roar, a warning that froze the blood of all who heard it. Doran understood then why Daenerys had been so confident. He had heard rumors about dragons. His spies confirmed them and many witnesses claimed to have seen them from afar, but until that moment they had not worried him. Young dragons could be dangerous, yes, but not impossible to kill. But what stood before him was not a hatchling, but a fully grown adult, black as the night, with yellow eyes that burned like Valyrian fire. It was enormous, large enough that its rider could claim the 7 kingdoms without opposition. And Daenerys had 4. She turned toward the creature and, without taking her eyes off Doran, gently placed her hand on Balerian's snout. The monster closed its eyes and lowered its head into her touch, like a domesticated feline. "Do you accuse me, Prince of Dorne?" she asked, using his title with a tone of contempt, "when you were fully aware of your daughter's plan against me." "I ordered no such thing," he replied in a firm voice. "I knew nothing of this nonsense." Daenerys's laugh was brief, hollow, and devoid of joy. "How curious," she said with a hint of mockery, "that the high and mighty ruler of Dorne, famed for his cunning and diplomacy, somehow overlooks the mobilization of 30 soldiers inside his own fortress." Doran drew a slow breath. He had not overlooked that movement. He was simply accustomed to Ariane's painfully obvious schemes and trusted he could contain their consequences. This time, however, the scale of the problem exceeded him. Attempting to take the last Targaryen hostage was something whose repercussions he could not control. "It is only the actions of a foolish girl," the prince replied. "Treat them as such." Daenerys shook her head with a scornful smile. "The punishment for treason," she continued in a steady voice, "is death." Some of Doran's guards stepped forward, but a growl from Balerion stopped them in their tracks. "If you kill her," said Doran gravely, "Dorne will never follow you. You will earn my enmity and that of all my people." "Then Dorne will burn," she answered, without the slightest doubt in her voice. Doran tried to find a way out of the problem before him, but attacking was impossible. The dragon would kill them before they could advance a single meter, yet he was not willing to allow Daenerys to kill his daughter. His thoughts were interrupted when Myrcella moved. At first he believed she would try to flee the scene, but what she did left him stunned. With a quick movement, she drew a dagger and pressed it against Ariane's throat, immobilizing her. Both Doran and the guards were shocked. In Dorne, Myrcella had always been seen as a defenseless girl, little more than a hostage, a political tool to be used later. The most incredulous, however, was Ariane, who could barely understand what was happening. "Myrcella," she cried, her voice an octave higher. "What are you doing?" "I'm sorry, princess," she replied, with a venom never before heard in her voice. "But Queen Daenerys offered to take me out of Dorne, an offer I have no intention of refusing." "How could you betray me like this?" Ariane whispered, stunned. "The day I arrived as a hostage you told me that, in Dorne, I could trust only you," Myrcella replied with an icy smile. "But I never said it went both ways." Doran felt his chest tighten. He loved his daughter above all things, and now he saw the edge of the dagger at her throat. "Take my life instead," he shouted, trying at all costs to prevent his daughter's death. "Do you think I'm a fool?" Daenerys asked with an ironic smile. "If I kill you, the entire region will destabilize and all of Dorne will unite against my family. Your daughter, on the other hand, is the one who offended me and she is not influential enough to matter." "Daenerys, be reasonable," Doran pleaded, panic seeping into his voice. She stared at him as she approached, and anger ignited in her violet eyes. "I have been more than reasonable all this time," she said, grinding her teeth. "Despite your hypocrisy and your disrespect, I asked you to join my family with courtesy." She stepped forward without taking her eyes off Doran. "But you have exhausted my patience," she continued, her voice low and steady. "I want you to know, Doran Martell, that even now, with what is about to happen, it will still be me being reasonable." Daenerys lowered her gaze for a moment, picked up the sword lying at her feet, and turned toward Ariane. Doran, desperate, was not willing to allow his daughter to die. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "I beg you, she is my daughter." Daenerys tilted her head slightly without turning to look at him. "Very well. Then beg," she said slowly. "I like it when men beg." Doran hesitated, ashamed, while his men exchanged glances. Begging was not only humiliating for a lord, it would erode his authority before his subjects and encourage their disloyalty. And Daenerys knew it. Unbowed, unbent, unbroken. That was the motto of House Martell. Though it was debatable, since Dorne had bent more than once over the centuries, it was the only house that had forced Aegon the Conqueror to negotiate after years of fruitless war. Dorne was not a true threat, but it was a persistent nuisance. If they opposed you, they would cost you troops and enormous sums of gold, even if they could never win. The gesture undermined the prince and at the same time offered him a way out that avoided Ariane's death. Because in truth she did not want to kill her. Despite her words, Daenerys knew that killing a Martell would only turn all of Dorne against her family. But by stripping its prince of dignity, she ensured that Doran would remain too busy rebuilding his prestige to conspire against her family. With a slight movement of her gaze, Daenerys forced him to kneel. Doran understood that as well, but between his prestige and losing his daughter, he chose to bow his head. "I beg you," he murmured, barely audible, but enough. Daenerys placed her foot on his head and slowly increased the pressure until Doran's forehead struck the stone and blood began to slide between the tiles. "I want you to remember this," she said in a cold, steady voice. "In all the years to come, in your most private moments, you will remember that you are all alive because the Drackle have allowed it." She removed her foot and Doran remained bowed, not daring to lift his head. "Remember it well," she added, "the Drackle do not give second chances." Daenerys then turned toward Arianne, who remained immobilized with Myrcella's dagger pressed against her throat. Doran raised his head when he saw her advancing toward his daughter. "You promised to leave her alive," he shouted, his voice dry. "That is true," Daenerys replied, "but I will make sure she remembers it." With every step, her fingers lengthened and her nails slowly transformed into sharp black claws. Doran looked away when Daenerys raised her hand. A moment later, the screams of agony from the Princess of Dorne spread across the hanging gardens. Chapter 96, Chapter 93. The Rock Breaks. 93. Smoke still rose from the melted gate of Casterly Rock, bent, burned, and warped. The roar of battle had ceased hours ago, but the smell of burned flesh, blood, and metal still lingered in the air. The Black Cloaks, as Vlad had named his militia, moved among the bodies, clearing the dead, securing the battlements, and checking corridors where stragglers might still be hiding. The Unsullied, who for the most part held command within Vlad's army, were carefully counting the survivors. More than 6,000 Lannister men, almost all archers and soldiers who had held out to the end, though everything had been futile from the moment Vlad melted the gates. On the side of the Black Fleet, not a single ship had been lost after the capture of Lannisport, and casualties were minimal in comparison. Even so, Vlad took the time to understand the cause of each loss, for he was not willing to let the arrogance of victory compromise his strategic judgment. The great inner courtyard had become an improvised stage where knights, squires, and soldiers stood lined up at the center, fear reflected on their faces. Some still held on to the resolve to die with their heads high and their honor intact, at least until the women were brought out from the fortress. No matter how meticulous Tywin's planning had been, no one could predict the exact moment of the attack or evacuate families in time. Thus, within the rock lived nobles, soldiers, and servants alongside wives, daughters, and children too young to wield a weapon when the castle fell. Horror spread as they were gathered in the courtyard. There was no pushing or blows, but the mere presence of armed men escorting women and children was enough to chill the blood of the survivors. Even the proudest nobles, accustomed to placing their name above any affection, could not hide their unease at seeing their entire bloodline under the gaze of the enemy. Nearly all the great houses of the West were there. Kevan Lannister with the few of his lineage who had survived, Daemon Marbrand, the Craycalls, and many others. Vlad smiled as he took in the scene. The Rock had spared him weeks of marches and unnecessary negotiations. All the important names were gathered in one place. The father of the dragon then appeared on the balcony overlooking the courtyard. His Valyrian steel armor and red cloak moved with the wind, untouched, as if he had not commanded a siege only hours before. His blonde hair fell loose to his shoulders and his golden eyes reflected an unnatural gleam. His flawless bearing and inhuman beauty were unsettling against the devastation surrounding him. When he stopped and all eyes turned to him, he spoke. His deep, velvety voice would have been hypnotic under other circumstances, were it not for the fear for their lives and those of their families that drowned out all other thoughts. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," he greeted with perfect courtesy, inclining his head slightly. "Decency compels me to introduce myself, although I suppose some of you have already guessed who I am." The confusion was evident, especially among the peasant soldiers, who rarely knew who they were truly fighting. "No one?" Vlad asked after a brief pause. "Very well. I am Vlad Drackle of Houses Drackle and Targaryen and, as of today, your ruler, though I imagine you know me better by other names." A murmur spread through the courtyard. His name was less known in Westeros than the titles attached to it, but one voice spoke it without hesitation. Kevan Lannister stepped forward, his expression rigid. "Of course," he said with hatred, forcing the words as if they burned his tongue. The Impaler. The muffled cry of several women was the only sound before restrained sobs turned into open weeping. To them, thanks to the faith of the Seven funded by the Lannisters, the Impaler was not a man, but a monster, the story told to children before sleep and one no one expected to see made real. In flesh and blood, Vlad replied with courtesy, "But you may use your majesty when addressing me, as your etiquette dictates." He paid no attention to the crying and addressed the men directly, for in Westeros decisions still rested with them. Kevin Lannister seemed even less pleased. If Vlad had been a savage, it would have been easy to despise him. But this man carried himself with impeccable manners and an insulting calm, and even so Kevin was not willing to yield. "It does not matter how many of us you defeat, Impaler," he said, spitting the title, "we will fight to the last man. We will not allow a monster to rule our lands. Not even if you impale us, burn us, or kill us with your sorcery." Vlad rolled his eyes, annoyed. "Spare me the false morality, my lord," he replied with contempt. "You are a Lannister. For you no price is too high and no atrocity lies beyond reach. Or has losing your brother softened you? Do not dare speak of my brother." Kevin spat, his jaw tense. "He was no monster like you." Vlad spread his arms and raised his voice so all could hear. "Would you have me imitate your dear brother when he entered King's Landing?" he asked. "Would you feel safer if I acted exactly as he did?" Kevin paled. "Fortunately for all of you," Vlad continued, now without mockery, "I would not stoop so low, not even before my enemies." He turned toward the crowd, who watched him in silence. "You are fortunate people of the West," he proclaimed in his magnetic tone. "I have not come to destroy your homes or kill your families. These lands, and all they contain, were taken from my wife through deceit and conspiracy, and as her husband I could not allow it." He descended the steps at a slow pace until he stood at their level, and to his right Ser Barristan Selmy took position, his gaze fixed, though his presence was unnecessary. "So I will make you a single offer, gentlemen," Vlad announced. "Bend the knee and swear loyalty to me and my family. I swear by my blood that you will keep your lands and titles and that you will prosper as never before." No one answered. Vlad let a second pass and allowed himself a faint smile. "I see no one wishes to take the first step," he added. "I understand distrust is prudent, but you must choose. Swear loyalty to me." He left the sentence hanging and calmly returned to the platform from which he had begun his speech, while all eyes followed his every step. Then, a colossal shadow covered the sky. The ground trembled as it received the creature's weight. The stone vibrated under the impact, and the crash merged with a guttural roar that froze the blood of those present. The dragon rose behind Vlad and slowly folded its wings. Its gaze moved over the men one by one. No one dared even breathe. Vlad turned back toward them, as if the beast at his back were of no importance, and fixed his eyes on those who still defied him. "Or you may refuse," he concluded with a predator smile, "and burn." The silence held for a few seconds after Vlad's last words, until one knee struck the stone and, almost immediately, others followed. Vlad did not intervene or rush the moment. He simply watched as the men of the West lowered their heads one after another. He knew it was not loyalty but fear, yet if being the most hated man in Westeros made them do what was necessary to survive the long night, he did not care. Greylon approached and quietly informed him that the throne room had already been secured. Once known as Grey Worm, he had been the commander of the Unsullied and now exercised near-direct control over Vlad's army. He had earned his trust and respect, and for that reason Vlad had long insisted that he abandon that name. It was no longer necessary for him to remain bound to his slave name. Vlad needed the best men for what was coming, and no matter how much weight that name carried, it was time for Greylon to move forward. With the surrender complete, control of Casterly Rock was consolidated quickly. Vlad walked through the corridors accompanied by Greylon and Lena, followed by a small group of Western nobles who kept their distance. He had expected something different. Even accounting for victory, he had anticipated attempts to buy time, hide resources, or prepare a delayed response. For a moment he considered whether he had overestimated the Lords of the West, though perhaps it was the three dragons circling above the rock that had eliminated any possibility of resistance before it could even be considered. When he entered the throne room, his attention settled on the former Lannister seat, raised upon the dais, worked in gilded metal and heavy with ostentatious detail, gold and jewels. He studied it for a moment before ascending the steps. "Remove it," he said at last without raising his voice. The men hesitated for a second before beginning to dismantle it. And bring 2 new thrones, he added while his gaze moved across the space. Of stone, simple. He stopped at the center of the dais, as if measuring the arrangement. And make sure they are well cushioned, he remarked with a hint of irony. Lena allowed herself a faint smile, while Greylon remained motionless at his side. Vlad rested a hand on the golden backrest before it was taken away. I never understood the need to make uncomfortable a seat you are supposed to spend much of your life on, he said quietly, genuinely puzzled by yet another of the decisions the Targaryens had made throughout their rule. The reorganization of the hall was swift, and by the time the sun began to set, the symbols of House Lannister had vanished from the dais. Several days later, Vlad gathered the few men he considered necessary to consolidate his control over the West. It was not a formal council, but it was enough to establish the first decisions without wasting time. Greylon stood at his right with the same rigid posture, while Lena occupied the opposite side, watching the room attentively. Marwyn remained somewhat apart, distracted by the architecture and writing from time to time on a parchment resting on the table. Facing them, Kevin Lannister waited. He stopped a few steps away before speaking. "You sent for me," he said, and after a brief pause added in a more rigid tone, "Your Majesty." Vlad did not seem affected and, instead of answering immediately, gestured lightly toward the table set up provisionally in the room. "Sit, sir," he said in his usual deep tone. Kevin obeyed without protest and took a seat opposite him, keeping his back straight and his gaze fixed. "You know these lands better than anyone," Vlad said as he placed a hand on the table. "You understand the politics of each lord and the infrastructure required to govern the West." He paused briefly before continuing. "I plan to introduce significant changes," he continued without looking away. "But to do so without creating instability, I need someone capable of administering these lands and applying those changes without turning them into a greater problem." Kevin frowned slightly, processing the proposal. "Do you intend to use me against the other lords of the West?" he asked, and although his tone remained controlled, the tension showed in his jaw. Vlad shook his head lightly. "Use is a strong word," he replied calmly. "I have no intention of forcing betrayals or encouraging conspiracies over plots of land or pieces of gold." He slid his fingers over the surface of the table before continuing. "I have more resources than I will need for decades, and if more were ever required, the Iron Bank would be willing to provide them within weeks." He added, lifting his gaze slightly. "Bleeding the West gains me nothing." The silence held for a moment before he continued, his tone colder. "The only thing I wish to avoid is unnecessary trouble," he said without looking away. "I do not need conspiracies or rebellions, nor to be forced into sending a message by impaling several hundred nobles so the rest understand their place." Kevin felt a chill, but Vlad let the idea settle before continuing, his expression unchanged. "That would only make the small folk see me as a tyrant for reasons that could have been avoided," he added calmly. "Their opinion does not dictate my decisions, but I have no interest in worsening it without cause." Kevin held his gaze for a few seconds, as if searching for any trace of mockery or deceit. Finally, much to his own displeasure, he inclined his head. "I understand," he said quietly. "I will do whatever is necessary." It was not loyalty, but Vlad knew Kevin was loyal only to his people and to the nobles of the West, and for now that was enough to avoid more drastic measures. Vlad gave a slight nod and changed the subject without transition. "Princess Myrcella will arrive in just over a week," he said, straightening slightly. "She will meet with Daenerys and travel under her protection to the West." Kevin did not react immediately, but concern showed on his face. "As for the dragons," Vlad continued, "they will not remain within the fortress. They will settle in the nearby hills and will not interfere with the villagers or the fields." He paused for a moment before adding, with a barely perceptible edge in his voice, "In the same way, I expect no one to interfere with them." Kevin nodded again, this time without visible tension. "I will see to it," he replied firmly. "You may go," Vlad concluded. Kevin rose without haste and, after a brief bow, left the hall with a different attitude from the one he had shown upon entering. The silence lasted a moment before Vlad turned his attention back to the rest of the table. Greylon stood at his right, unmoving, occupying the place of Ser Barristan Selmy, who had been sent on a mission beyond Casterly Rock, while Marwyn rested a hand on the parchments spread across the table and wrote calmly, and Lena waited, watching for the moment to speak. "What information do we have from King's Landing?" Vlad asked as he placed his fingers on the table. Lena rose and stepped forward before answering, keeping her gaze fixed on him. "Cersei has not wasted any time," she said as she stopped before the table. She has taken advantage of her son being occupied with more immediate matters and has begun consolidating her power through the faith. Marwyn looked up, attentive. As a former maester, he knew well the politics behind the faith of the Seven and the real influence it held over Westeros. Lars has risen as the new leader of the Sparrows. Lena continued. Cersei believes she can control him, so she has no qualms about making concessions such as allowing the restoration of the faith militant. Greylon frowned slightly before speaking. That is more than imprudent, he said as he crossed his arms. Giving weapons to any faith is giving power to an institution that answers to no lord and considers itself above any worldly authority. Marwyn nodded faintly, placing both hands on the table. More than that, he added, tilting his head slightly, allowing the faith of the Seven to possess an armed force is dangerous for the entire system of Westeros. Left unchecked, it could fracture the established order and displace the nobility from power. Vlad did not interrupt them as they spoke. It was predictable, he said, leaning lightly on the table. Cersei Lannister acts as if she had her father's mind between her shoulders, but she is far from as intelligent as Tywin. His gaze remained fixed for a moment before he continued. The faith militant is a problem but also a tool. He added, the fact that Lars is at its head allows us to track their movements and anticipate them, while also giving us a direct path to dismantle the faith's influence in Westeros far more quickly than we otherwise could. He slid his fingers lightly over the table. If the faith takes the first step toward conflict, he continued without changing his tone, we will be able to respond from a stronger position without needing to justify it to anyone. Lena nodded and, after a brief silence, took out a small vial and set it on the table. Edward sent this from his expedition in the far north, she said as she pushed it forward. Vlad took the container between his fingers and raised it slightly to examine it in the light. Warg blood, he said in a neutral tone. It could not have been easy to obtain. He turned the vial with a slight movement, evaluating it in silence. Beyond the curiosity such an ability might provoke, the applications were evident. Espionage, communication, control over other creatures, and even a greater connection with his own dragons. He set the vial carefully back on the table before straightening slightly. That will be all, gentlemen, he said calmly. You may withdraw. Vlad paused for a moment, resting his hands on the table. He breathed in slowly, as if organizing his thoughts. That routine of reports, decisions, and disputes bored him, so he allowed himself a few seconds of silence before continuing. For now, he would rule like this, with capable advisors and one day at a time. Chapter 97, Chapter 94. Chaos is a ladder. 94. The air of King's Landing was as terribly unpleasant as ever. If Vlad had been there, he would no doubt have cursed the Targaryens again for creating an absurdly unnecessary network of underground tunnels instead of a proper sewage system. But aside from the stench, life in the streets seemed to be improving. The war had ended, at least in appearance, and merchants resumed their travels while prices began to stabilize, supported by Tyrell provisions. The small folk, as gullible as ever, began to convince themselves that peace had returned thanks to the crown. The lines outside bakeries were long, sailors returned to the docks, and artisans reopened their workshops, while only in the taverns did rumors about Vlad and his armies circulate, though nothing that seemed truly significant. Not yet. The faith was the first to shape those rumors, for in the Sept sermons the new sparrows spoke of the one who used vile sorcery, of a blasphemous king determined to enslave all the good men of Westeros, and of his wife, the last Targaryen, a creature born of incest who murdered innocent women to remain young and beautiful. Thus they built the image of an absolute evil that only the Seven could confront, which, of course, served their own interests. The more fear that shadow inspired, the stronger the priest's influence became. Meanwhile, the nobles of the capital, oblivious to all this, continued indulging in their games, organizing banquets, sealing marriage alliances, and offering their daughters to the Tyrells almost in bulk. They believed the worst had passed with the deaths of Joffrey and Tywin. However, the reality was that the court was far from stable, for the Lannisters, without Tywin to guide them and with Cersei as the sole head in the capital, were slowly losing ground to the Tyrells. Lady Olenna remained in King's Landing while preparations for her granddaughter's wedding were finalized. A wedding she herself financed, as she so often liked to remind others. Tommen was only just beginning to enter puberty and still had years before he could be considered a man. Yet none of this seemed to concern the Tyrells nor Marjorie, who had already secured both the boy's attention and her influence over him. What they did not expect was that, for one reason or another, the boy would actively strive to be a good ruler, reading books about previous kings considered competent and insisting on attending council meetings. The good news was that he accepted decisions as long as the majority agreed. For her part, Cersei sank deeper into paranoia. After the fiasco of Lookard's trial by combat, she personally ensured that the High Septon, who had promised his cooperation in exchange for a generous donation, disappeared under mysterious circumstances during a journey to the Citadel. In his place, she made sure that the new religious sect, the Sparrows, rose to power without obstacle, and the new High Sparrow was none other than Lars of the Vale, the very same young man she believed she had manipulated into leading the faith. Meanwhile, inside the Red Keep, Peter Baelish sat in his chambers, contemplating with satisfaction the parchment open before him. It was not an important letter, merely a report from his spies at court, yet he read it with great pleasure. He had left King's Landing before the Red Wedding, officially to secure the support of the Vale, though in truth he had already had Lisa Arryn eating from his hand long before that. Marrying her had been the logical step, the key that made him Lord Protector of the Vale, master of castles and troops, the loving father of a sickly boy who would not be surprising if he died in the coming years, and the husband of a mother who signed every order he dictated. Lisa was useful, though to him she had never been more than that. A woman too fragile, too eager to please him, and too obsessed with him, who posed no challenge and barely satisfied him enough for her company to be tolerable. He found her almost tedious, though he would never admit it. Caitlin, on the other hand, she had been the desire, the unattainable goal, the one who never yielded to his smile or his words, the only one who had truly made him want to possess her. The memory of her death at that cursed wedding still poisoned him. And Sansa, little Sansa, had been the closest thing to reclaiming that dream, to shape her, to have her in his hands, to use her as an heir and as a woman, as a political weapon and as a consolation for his obsession. But that card had slipped from his grasp, for some more skillful player had returned the girl to her brother in the north, and Littlefinger had never known for certain who had pulled the strings. He suspected the spider, of course, but that blow still haunted him. If I could not have Caitlin, having her daughter would have been enough. I would have made her mine, one way or another. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a satisfied sigh, because everything had followed its course. Chaos, after all, had always been his domain. Others feared war, but he understood it better than anyone. Chaos is a ladder. The interruption came at just the right moment to spoil his reverie. A servant knocked at the door, nervous, his voice trembling. "My lord, a messenger has arrived. I fear he brings urgent news," said one of the servants as he caught his breath. Peter raised an eyebrow, amused, because news arrived constantly, though he usually received it before anyone else thanks to his network. He liked that detail, always being one step ahead, knowing secrets even the council itself did not yet grasp. So he rose calmly, smoothed the fold of his tunic, and walked toward the entrance, while his fox-like smile returned to his face, ready to play with whatever that man had brought. The messenger, covered in dust from the journey, handed him a sealed parchment with trembling hands, and Littlefinger broke it open calmly, already savoring how he would use that information against his rivals or how he would sell his neutrality to the highest bidder. However, the smile vanished by the second line, and by the time his eyes reached the end of the message, it had disappeared completely. The letter spoke of a black fleet of hundreds of ships that had encircled the coasts up to Lannisport, taking it with little difficulty, and then, after less than a day of fighting, Casterly Rock had fallen. There were even clear mentions of fire sorcery that melted the gates into pools of molten metal. Peter Baelish remained still as the parchment crumpled under the pressure of his fingers. It was inconceivable. The rock was a fortress and should not have fallen so quickly, so he decided to keep that information to himself until he could confirm it. However, as more and more messengers began to arrive in the following days, all bearing the same news, he had no choice but to accept the truth. The rock had fallen in less than a day. Unheard of. That thought left him with a deep sense of unease, for the capital was, at the very least, 10 times easier to conquer than the rock. Even so, Littlefinger was not a weak man, so after gathering all the necessary information, he went to the council to report the situation and, in the process, devise how to profit from it. After all, chaos was a ladder, wasn't it? Citadel, 3 days after the fall of Casterly Rock. The citadel rose over Old Town, formed by stone towers, courtyards, and corridors where maesters worked tirelessly. Some walked with parchments in hand, others spoke in low voices while reviewing texts, and many simply wrote, absorbed in their work. Life there was simple, for those who inhabited the citadel lived devoted to study or their own matters, largely detached from the intrigues of the rest of Westeros. There were scarcely any court conspiracies, and the Hightowers, lords of the city, remained a stable presence, preventing tensions and open factions. Above all, the Hightower Tower dominated the horizon, visible from any point in the city. At its highest point, a chamber remained closed. Inside, several elderly men sat waiting around a stone table, their chains resting upon their chests. The links clinked softly at the slightest movement, all tipped with Valyrian steel. In practice, they were the highest authority of the citadel, though the institution itself rejected any formal hierarchy beyond accumulated knowledge. The door opened and a maester entered, notably younger than the rest, though in the citadel that meant around 50 years old. He crossed the room without haste and took his place. The silence lasted only a few seconds before he spoke. "Gentlemen, I bring bad news. We have lost the West," the younger man announced. Glances were exchanged. "That is unheard of," one frowned. "The Rock is the strongest fortress in Westeros. Only Harrenhal could compare. A siege should last months, even years." "It did not," the younger man replied without hesitation. "It fell after 2 days of fighting." Several shifted in their seats. "That makes no sense." The obese elder shook his head. "It cannot have fallen so quickly." "Calm yourselves," another bald elder intervened. "If it is true, we need to understand how it happened. Did the Impaler use his dragons?" "No," the younger man answered. "The dragons did not participate. According to our reports, they arrived after the fortress had already been taken." The silence tightened. "Then explain it." He placed his hands on the table, because even with a fleet and a considerable army, taking the Rock in 2 days is absurd. "Did he have men inside? Were the gates open to him?" "There is no evidence of that," he replied. "Our informants agree on the same account." Vlad Dracul dismounted and advanced to the gates, and there he used what we can only describe as pyromancy to melt steel doors over 10 centimeters thick as if it were nothing. No one spoke for several seconds. "That is impossible," one muttered. "There is no record of pyromantic capability of such magnitude, not even in the Age of Heroes." "Is this confirmed?" another asked. "It is irrelevant," the younger man said, making them all frown. "Whether he breached the gates using magic or dragons does not matter, though it must be investigated thoroughly." "What do you mean it doesn't matter?" The obese elder nearly snapped. "Vlad Dracul is just as capable of taking the throne now as he was when he gained dragons," he said seriously. "I have no doubt that if the claims about his magic are real, it makes him more dangerous, but that does not change the fact that only dragons would have allowed him to conquer Westeros on his own." "You are not wrong," said the thin man, "but such magical capability presents problems we must address." "Faceless men, perhaps," another elder suggested. "Too expensive," the obese one said. "They would ask for all of Westeros as payment." The youngest placed his hands on the table. "This has ceased to be a problem we can delegate," he continued. "Vlad Dracul is a threat to Westeros and to us. A magic user with such capabilities has no precedent, and if we do not act now—" He left the sentence hanging. "I propose we deal with him immediately," he concluded. There was a brief silence, but all nodded, though not with enthusiasm. The Citadel had avoided overt conspiracies since the Dance of the Dragons, preferring subtler methods ever since. "And how do you propose we do that?" asked the obese elder. The younger man smiled. "I have heard that in King's Landing a new faction of the Faith of the Seven is gaining power," he explained, almost savoring it. "It has even convinced the Queen Regent to allow the restoration of the Faith Militant." Several exchanged glances. The Faith Militant was a serious matter, but it could serve their immediate interests. "What do they call themselves?" asked the thin man. "The Sparrows," the younger man replied with a smile. Chapter 98, Chapter 95, The Boy King. 95. The council chamber was, as always, crowded. After the debacle of the Mountains trial by combat and Tywin's death, the council had been almost entirely reshaped. Peter Baelish, newly returned from the Vale, held the position of Master of Whisperers, while Qyburn had been appointed Master of Laws, in what was clearly a move by Cersei to secure an extra vote at the table. Mace Tyrell, swollen with pride, oversaw the fleet as Master of Ships despite his limited experience, and his mother, the ever-gracious Lady Olenna, temporarily assumed the role of Master of Coin, at least until a more suitable candidate could be found. Old Pycelle remained Grand Maester, but both his opinion and his presence were becoming increasingly inconvenient for Cersei. Formally, King Tommen presided over the sessions, but for weeks it had been her who organized them, chaining proposals together under increasingly flimsy excuses to concentrate power or make concessions to the Faith of the Seven. To anyone with political experience, the pattern was obvious, though Cersei seemed convinced that her cleverness kept it hidden. Lately, however, it was Tommen himself who occupied the central role. Despite the persistent recommendations of his advisors, the boy insisted on attending every meeting and, more importantly, on taking part. He was trying to learn. He read chronicles of past kings, studied their laws and decisions, and asked questions freely of his counselors, absorbing everything he could. Part of that change was due to Marjorie, who had turned politics into a game, presenting him with problems and solving them alongside him, which not only strengthened their relationship but also began to sharpen the boy's thinking. Still shy and uncertain, he continued to seek validation from those around him, but from time to time he showed a judgment of his own that broke that pattern. That morning was one of those moments. He had proposed reducing the expenses of the royal wedding to a minimum, but the proposal met immediate opposition. For Mace Tyrell it was a matter of image. For Olenna and Marjorie, of stability and of what that image projected to the realm. For Cersei, however, it was a matter of pride. Tommen saw it differently. To him, it seemed unnecessary to waste months of food on a feast when winter was approaching and supplies might run short. Even so, not all his arguments were enough. "It is not necessary," said Cersei, her gaze fixed on her son. "A royal wedding must be an event the realm remembers. The expenses will be reduced," Tommen replied, holding her gaze. Cersei shook her head slightly, pressing her lips together. "Tommen, this is not," she began, but did not finish the sentence. "Mother?" Tommen repeated, this time with more firmness, though a slight tremor still lingered in his voice. Cersei narrowed her eyes, preparing to respond. "Mother, I insist," he repeated, marking each word without looking away. Cersei clenched her jaw, unable to fully hide her irritation. Olenna saw it and barely suppressed a smile before conceding. She did not entirely agree, but if it served to undermine Cersei, she would not waste the opportunity. "Let us move to a more important matter," said the king after a brief silence, his gaze passing over those present. "I understand that Oberyn Martell was poisoned during my brother's wedding." The Dornish delegation left the capital shortly after, and not on good terms. Cersei rested an elbow on the table, showing no interest. "And what do the Dornish matter?" she said with contempt. Tommen held her gaze for a moment. "It matters," he replied. "My sister is still in Sunspear, and for the Prince of Dorne to have been poisoned under our roof is not a good image for the crown. It would be wise to resolve this incident." Cersei did not answer immediately, but her expression tightened. "Dorne had no intention of having that incident investigated," she said dismissively. "Most likely Oberyn poisoned himself while playing with his precious venoms. It is beneath the crown to chase after its subjects solving their problems." Tommen shook his head, a slight grimace forming at his mother's stubbornness. "My grandfather did not see it that way," the boy added. "He had planned an agreement with House Martell. I understand his intention was to marry Doran's son to Myrcella." Cersei narrowed her eyes and shifted her gaze toward Maester Pycelle, a clear promise of pain in her look. The old maester lowered his head immediately, avoiding any reaction. "I will not sell my daughter like a brood mare," she said without looking away. "No Dornishman is worthy of her." Tommen did not yield. "It could be a way to secure Myrcella's position and stabilize our relationship with Dorne," he continued, almost exasperated at having to justify himself. "It would resolve what happened without escalating the conflict." Cersei let out a brief sigh. "There is no need for you to concern yourself with this," she concluded, almost proud of her decision. "I have sent Jaime to bring her back." Tommen frowned. "You did so without consulting me?" he asked, indignant. Cersei held his gaze, unbothered. There was no need to trouble the king with such a trivial matter. She said this time in a softer tone, trying to calm the increasingly resistant boy. Tommen leaned slightly forward. "My sister's safety is not a trivial matter," he said, visibly angered. "Do not make decisions like this again without consulting me." Cersei opened her mouth, ready to respond, but at that moment the council doors opened. Peter Baelish entered with quick steps, offering a slight bow. "I beg your pardon for the interruption, Your Majesty," he said seriously. "A messenger has arrived from the Western lands, and I fear he brings bad news." Cersei looked at him coldly, not bothering to hide her disdain. "Speak," she ordered, ignoring Tommen. Littlefinger gave a slight nod before continuing. "A fleet of more than 100 warships has attacked Lannisport and taken the city," he said in a measured tone. "They then advanced on Casterly Rock. I am afraid the fortress fell in less than a day." Everyone was stunned by the news. Tommen went still and pale, as if he could not fully process what he had just heard. "Impossible," Cersei said, rising abruptly and fixing her gaze on Littlefinger. Olenna did not move. "Are you telling me that Casterly Rock did not hold for even a single day?" she asked, tilting her head. "How is it that we are only hearing of an attack of this magnitude now?" Littlefinger held her gaze for a moment before answering. It appears that all the ravens from the coastal strongholds between the West and King's Landing have disappeared. He explained calmly. The messages arrived by land, and 5 days have passed since the attack. Cersei struck the table with her palm. It must be a lie, she snapped in frustration. Who would have such an army? Littlefinger took out a piece of parchment and placed it on the table. A black dragon on a red field, pierced by a sun and a sword. I merely repeat the claims of the messengers, he added cautiously, but it is reasonable to assume that the Impaler is invading Westeros. Tommen swallowed before speaking. And my uncle? And my cousins? He asked, staring at Littlefinger. There is no clear news about Kevin, he replied seriously. Those few who escaped knew almost nothing, and I suspect many were allowed to flee so the news would spread. Olenna leaned slightly forward. Then we cannot wait, she said decisively. I will depart for the Reach and gather my bannermen. Secure the border with the western lands. If they advance, we must be ready. You cannot possibly believe this story. Cersei raised her voice, clearly irritated. How could the greatest fortress in Westeros fall? Olenna looked at her without patience. Temper yourself, you are not a child, she replied coldly. It does not matter whether it is true or not, we will act as if it is. Tommen took a deep breath and straightened his back. Lady Olenna, you are right, he said more firmly. Return to the Reach and prepare your forces. I will gather mine and march to the Reach as soon as possible. He turned his gaze to Littlefinger. And you, bring me the men who managed to escape, he added, maintaining a serious tone. I want to hear their account directly. Littlefinger inclined his head, barely concealing a faint smile as his mind began weighing how to profit from the situation. As you command, your grace, he replied evenly. Tommen sat back down, his expression serious and his gaze fixed on the table. Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves, he said after a brief silence. From this moment on, we are at war. Snow fell gently over the walls of Winterfell, covering towers and battlements with a white mantle, and in the distance the sky lit up intermittently with lightning from a storm spreading over the Godswood. Though inside the castle it was little more than a distant murmur. The great hall was full. Tables stretched from one end to the other, covered with meat, bread, and overflowing jugs, while the guests drank and spoke with cheer, and the minstrels played a light, lively tune as some knights kept the rhythm with their hands against the wood. Robb watched the scene from his place, with a sense of calm he had not felt in a long time. At the high table, his father presided over the feast. Eddard Stark sat upright with his usual bearing, exchanging jokes with his friend Robert, who laughed heartily. At his side, his mother spoke in low tones with Cersei Lannister, who laughed along with her, and at one point a comment from Cersei made Catelyn clutch her pendant marked with the symbol of the weirwood roots, looking at Cersei with feigned indignation before letting out a complicit laugh. Robb looked away, avoiding staring for some reason. To his father's right, Robert Baratheon raised his cup with a restrained and elegant smile, laughing with Ned as he drank in moderation. For the king was slender, upright, and carried himself with regal poise, clearly not much given to drink. Further down the table, Joffrey Baratheon laughed naturally as he spoke with Sansa, his long black hair framing a face that smiled at her with warmth. Yet the boy was polite and modest, keeping a respectful distance, and Sansa answered him with a sincere and equally enchanted smile. Nearby, Cersei had begun speaking to her daughter Myrcella in a gentle tone, while the girl split her attention between her and Arya, who tugged at her arm trying to pull her somewhere, likely to explore or play some prank, maintaining her usual restless energy. A little farther along, Jon Stark leaned toward Bran, sharing some comment that drew a brief laugh from both, and no one minded that he sat at the high table, because that was how it had always been. Robb let out a faint breath, satisfied, because although organizing feasts was exhausting, this one was entirely worth it, especially seeing his family gathered. He lowered his gaze to his own hands and then to the woman seated beside him. Talisa held the child carefully, cradling him with familiarity, and the boy slept, oblivious to the noise of the hall, wrapped in thick cloth, while Robb rested a hand on his head in a gentle gesture. It was a true blessing that the war had ended, or so he thought as he looked at the child in his arms, though the idea made him frown slightly. War? What war? He remembered a war, even that he had fought in it, but the details slipped away from him, vague and incomplete. For a moment he remained still, trying to grasp them, but the smiling face of his wife was enough for him to set the thought aside as easily as it had appeared. It was not the time for unnecessary thoughts. He then lifted his gaze toward the hall just as a flash of lightning illuminated the tall windows, and the light crossed the room for an instant, and in that brief flicker his father's chair stood empty, though when he blinked his father was still there, as if he had never moved. No one reacted, as if nothing had happened. So Rob said nothing either and leaned back slightly to take his cup, letting the sound of the music fill the space and cover any trace of discomfort. Another flash of lightning split the sky, and for an instant King Robert appeared as a bloated and disheveled man, with a horn lodged in an open wound in his belly. But Rob did not look up, even when the next flash came and his father's head was no longer upon his shoulders, leaving only a bleeding stump. Meanwhile Joffrey's appearance changed completely, his skin bruised and his eyes bloodshot beneath golden hair, and yet no one said anything, and Rob simply kept looking at his wife and his son. Eddard Stark leaned slightly to his right, resting his arm on the table as he looked at Robert with a faint smile. "Are you enjoying the feast?" he asked with a hint of mockery, knowing he was not fond of celebrations. Robert set his half-finished cup down on the table before replying, his tone calm and sincere, while he took Cersei's hand in an almost absent gesture. "The food is exquisite, Ned, and the company even more so," said Robert calmly while holding Cersei's hand in his. Cersei inclined her head slightly toward Catelyn, maintaining a kind smile that softened her features. "I must say I greatly appreciate your hospitality," she said with a faint smile. "You have arranged a wonderful feast." Catelyn responded with a slight nod. "It is an honor to receive your majesties in the north," she added, maintaining her composure. Robert let out a small exhale before looking around the hall. "Though the music," he added, raising his voice slightly so the minstrels could hear him, "is the same as what one hears in King's Landing, I would appreciate something more fitting of the north." Eddard let out a genuine laugh as he shook his head slightly. "You may be right," he admitted while searching for his eldest son. "Rob." The voice reached him clearly, and Rob looked up, surprised to be called like that, as until then his attention had been on Talisa and the child. "Yes, father," he replied, straightening slightly in his seat. Eddard made a small gesture toward the minstrels. "You are the host," he said, nodding. "Choose the next song." Rob hesitated for a moment, but eventually nodded, rising to his feet and pausing briefly before approaching the minstrels. "I need you to play something new," he asked politely. "Something that will impress the king, something he has never heard before." The minstrel who had led most of the songs that evening stepped forward. His name was Edward, and his dark hair fell over a pale face, while his black eyes lingered on Rob for a moment as he smiled, though for some reason the gesture felt unsettling. "I spent years in Essos, my lord," he said calmly. "There I heard a melody that captivated me." He turned slightly toward the king, without losing his smile. "I doubt anyone present has ever heard it," he added with a barely perceptible undertone. Edward waited until the hall fell completely silent. He adjusted the lute in his hands and let his fingers glide softly over the strings, setting a slow, almost delicate melody. Some of those present followed the rhythm with slight movements of their heads, while others continued drinking, oblivious to any change. But not Rob. The first chord seemed to pin him to his seat, unable to move or speak, as his hands began to tremble. When Edward's baritone voice rose, it was as if multiple voices harmonized with his, overlapping in an impossible murmur, though no one seemed to find it strange, not even when the bard's eyes gleamed for an instant and his pupil turned blood red. Edward did not look away from him, and Rob felt his body tense, unable to avert his gaze. "I am the prophet with the answers you seek." The storm roared in the distance as the voice carried over the melody. Lightning briefly illuminated the tall windows of the hall, and the light swept across the room without anyone seeming to notice. "Time. I've unlocked it. I see past and future running free," the melody continued, soft and steady. Yet every note sent an involuntary shiver through Rob. Someone laughed at another table and another raised his cup, oblivious to the fear tightening in his chest. He tried to move, to look away, but his body did not respond. "There is a world where I help you get home. But that's not a world I know." Another bolt of lightning split the sky, closer this time, and for an instant the light filtered across the faces in the hall. Rob did not blink, but around him the faces twisted into corpses that laughed, spilled ale over open throats, or toyed with spears embedded in their own bodies as if nothing mattered. The cadence of the notes quickened as Edward seemed to fall into a trance, singing with a voice that was no longer singular. Rob heard the dark melody as the hall began to fade with each verse, transforming into images that seemed to rise with the music. "I see a song of past romance. I see the sacrifice of man. I see portrayals of betrayal and a brother's final stand. I see you on the brink of death. I see you draw your final breath." I see a man who gets to make it home alive, but it's no longer you. He saw himself meeting Talisa as she tended to the wounded on the battlefield, and then his father sacrificing his honor and his life in that square in King's Landing, surrounded by a crowd shouting for his head, all to protect his daughters. Then the image shifted, and he saw Theon taking Winterfell in his absence and killing Ser Roderick Castle, and Jon standing in the middle of a field, with a wolf-headed pommel sword in hand, facing a cavalry army alone. Then he saw himself pierced by crossbow bolts during a wedding, dropping to his knees beside the lifeless body of his pregnant wife. And finally, he saw himself rise many years later, with unnatural blue eyes, an empty expression, and a gaping wound that exposed flesh down to the bone. Fear ran through Robb, yet he seemed to be the only one aware of the changes around him, while the music only intensified the horror. His mother turned into a walking corpse, his father lost his head, Sansa stopped smiling and simply faded, and Arya appeared covered in scars, dressed in tight leather filled with knives. And still, Edward did not stop the melody, even when his entire audience was nothing but corpses. I see your palace covered in red, faces of men who had long believed you're dead. I see your wife with a man who is haunting, a man with a trail of bodies. The images returned as Robb saw the halls of Winterfell overrun by men dressed in black who murdered and raped indiscriminately anyone they found. And among them, figures gathered around the throne laughed mockingly in the middle of the slaughter. He saw a man with a sadistic smile, accompanied by 3 hunting dogs, moving through the castle while laughing, chasing something Robb could not quite see. I see a song of past romance. I see the sacrifice of man. I see portrayals of betrayal and a brother's final stand. I see you on the brink of death. I see you draw your final breath. I see a beast who gets to make it home alive. But it's no longer you. This time, the images Robb saw were completely unfamiliar. He saw a red-haired woman kissing a curly-haired man in a cave of hot springs, Hodder holding a door against creatures trying to break through it with fury, while several figures fled into a snowy landscape, and Ramsay Bolton, one of the most honorable men he had known, even legitimized in his father's will, smiling as he took Sansa's hand beneath a weirwood tree. Then he saw Bran, his brother, upon the roots of a tree, screaming in pain. And after that, he saw himself on his knees, wounded, holding a cup filled with a red liquid in trembling hands before bringing it to his lips. And once more, he saw himself looking up at the full moon, screaming in pain as his eyes turned a bright yellow, before raising his voice in a ragged howl. The voices that seemed to accompany Edward's song grew louder and louder, drowning everything out, until he could hear nothing but that melody. Then, a jolt tore him out of the trance. Robb's eyes snapped open as he jerked upright, air failing in his chest while the world took a moment to settle into place. His breathing was uneven and far too fast, and sweat soaked his forehead and neck, while beside him Talisa held him by the arms, leaning toward him, trying to make him look at her. "Robb." Her voice was low, tense. "Robb, look at me." He did not respond immediately, keeping his eyes open, fixed on some uncertain point in the room, taking several seconds to blink, to react, to recognize Talisa's face before him. The sound of the storm was still there, muffled by the walls, but it no longer set the rhythm of any melody, and Robb brought a hand to his chest, feeling the frantic heartbeat beneath his skin while Talisa embraced him, pulling him close with tears in her eyes. "Robb," she repeated, her voice breaking. "It was only a nightmare. My love." Robb was still trembling as the memory unraveled in his mind, blurring until it became nothing more than a shadow, though not the fear, which clung to him even when he remembered nothing. Robb wrapped his arms tightly around his wife, trying to steady his breathing and calm the pounding of his heart that would not slow, while a persistent thought forced its way into his mind, that it had not been just a nightmare. Chapter 99, Chapter 96. The Vision. 96. V. Dragonstone. Dragonstone rose above the sea, a fortress of dark stone set upon the coast, with its towers and walls outlined against the sky and the sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs that surrounded it. And although it remained as imposing as ever, the number of men living within it had dwindled over the months, so that with each passing week there were fewer guards on the walls and less movement in its courtyards. Stannis Baratheon had lost the war. A curious fact, considering that he had fought only a single great battle. At the Blackwater, he had gathered practically all the strength he possessed, the greatest fleet Westeros had assembled in years, and the vast majority of the men willing to follow him, including his vassals from Dragonstone and, above all, those from the Stormlands who had supported his claim. Unfortunately, Tyrion Lannister's ingenuity and Tywin's timely arrival transformed what had seemed an almost certain victory into a complete defeat, and the consequences did not take long to make themselves felt. The Stormlands had lost too many men to become involved in the war again, and many of its lords, or at least the few who remained, agreed to recognize Tommen as the legitimate Baratheon and ceased all hostility toward the Iron Throne, which in practice left Stannis isolated. After the defeat at the Blackwater, Stannis took no further part in any of the great battles of the war, instead remaining on Dragonstone to reorganize what little he had left while trying to gather support, but none of his efforts prospered. He sent envoys to the Iron Bank in search of funding, but his request, courtesy of a certain impaling lord, was rejected. He also tried to establish contact with the North, but at that moment, with Robb Stark consolidating his power, there was no way the North would involve itself in another war for the Iron Throne. As the months passed, his options dwindled until they were limited to his own island and the territories directly dependent upon it. Most of the men who still remained under his command did so not out of conviction, but because their houses, families, and livelihoods were tied to Dragonstone or the nearby islands, which in practice prevented them from leaving. In the end, what Stannis had left was a small core of loyal men and Melisandre. The Red Priestess had gained considerable influence within his circle since her arrival, largely because Stannis no longer had many other voices to rely upon, and her council, reinforced by the belief that he was the prince that was promised, was among the few things he still had to cling to. The Red Witch, for her part, was convinced that Stannis was the chosen of the Lord of Light and acted accordingly, reinforcing that belief through her words and small spells of suggestion that made her claims easier to accept without much resistance. However, that influence had its limits. Melisandre was not an exceptional sorceress, and although her mastery of fire magic allowed her to perform rituals and obtain visions, they were rarely clear or precise, forcing her to interpret them and, in many cases, leaving her completely in the dark until it was too late. Even so, she remained the closest thing to guidance that Stannis had left. But even the priestess was not infallible. She could not make men across the sea choose to follow Stannis, nor alter decisions that depended upon interests, resources, and wills entirely beyond her reach, and no matter how many rituals or sacrifices she performed, the situation did not change. Without new support, Stannis's cause slowly withered. But in the end, help did arrive. Whether through pure luck, divine intervention, as Melisandre believed, or a carefully orchestrated strategy by a certain eunuch, the Golden Company eventually arrived at Dragonstone, offering men, resources, and a real opportunity to reverse the situation. At the head of that force stood the young Griff, a boy barely older than 16 who presented himself as its commander, accompanied by a face Stannis knew well, the Spider Varys, whose presence made it clear that this was neither a simple coincidence nor selfless aid. They were willing to support his cause, but promises of titles or future rewards after the war were not enough. The Golden Company demanded something more solid, something that would guarantee their involvement beyond any immediate victory. This alliance had to be formalized through marriage, and the only possible candidate was Shireen Baratheon. Less than a year earlier, such a proposal would have been received by Stannis with disdain, if not outright hostility, because his rigidity and sense of duty would never have allowed him even to consider the idea of offering his daughter's hand to the commander of a mercenary company. But Stannis had not only lost the war, he found himself without real allies, with limited resources and no room to move beyond Dragonstone. And to all of this was added his conviction that he was the prince that was promised, a belief that did not allow him to consider the possibility of surrender or accepting defeat. So, although the proposal did not fit with what he would have considered acceptable under any other circumstance, he ultimately accepted it. Many of the men who still surrounded him did not share that decision, and among them Ser Davos stood out, for he had spent enough time around the girl to know her better than most, knowing that she was bright, kind, and very intelligent, which made the idea of giving her in marriage to a stranger, and a mercenary at that, difficult for him to accept. However, Stannis had already made his decision, and at that point there was no room for discussion. Shireen understood the situation better than many would have expected, because she understood enough to know that it would ease part of the burden her father carried, and although it was not an idea she found pleasant, she accepted it without protest. As was often said, the girl was as good as a girl could be. For her part, Melisandre supported the idea, and she did so with even greater conviction from the moment she met the young Griff, because upon seeing him she felt something that was not unfamiliar to her, a sensation she had experienced before, long ago, when she first arrived at the fortress and stood in the presence of Stannis Baratheon, a feeling she had always associated with the attention of her god. That sensation, in truth, was nothing more than the natural response of her own connection to fire magic, which reacted more intensely to places or people tied to it, as was the case with Dragonstone, or as it was now with the young Griff, whose blood still retained, albeit in diluted form, the affinity for fire possessed by the Dragon Lords. But Melisandre did not interpret it that way and, as always, a slave to her visions, she fit everything into another sign from her lord, one that reinforced the path she had followed until then. She did not abandon her belief in Stannis, at least not immediately, because she had built too many certainties upon that idea to discard it. For too long she had interpreted every vision as proof that he was the chosen one, so she did not consider the possibility that she had been mistaken, but instead assumed that her lord's plan encompassed more than she could see. She was convinced that if the Lord of Light had guided her to Stannis, then her presence on Dragonstone had been necessary, and if he now showed her another presence in the flames, then that too was part of the path she was meant to follow. But the truth was that if, at that moment, she had encountered another descendant of dragon blood, she would have felt the same thing and interpreted it in the same way, because Melisandre could not conceive of the possibility of being wrong, only of not having seen enough. That was why she did not reject the sensation, but it planted doubts in her mind, and it was precisely that doubt that unsettled her enough to decide to use every means at her disposal to dispel it, seeking a clearer answer in the flames. So she decided to seek answers in the fire. During a full moon night, Melisandre sat with her back straight and her hands resting on her knees. The chamber was a small windowless room, illuminated only by the flame of a candle and the reddish glow of a brazier, while smoke and heat gradually gathered between the stone walls. She had prepared a small ritual to strengthen her connection to the fire and try to obtain a clearer vision. She knew that forcing the bond with the Lord of Light in such a way could be dangerous, because even an experienced priestess could lose herself in what she saw or damage her own body in the process. But even so, she took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Visions sometimes came on their own, soft and indistinct, while at other times they burst forth violently. But that night she was not willing to settle for blurred images or difficult-to-interpret symbols, because she wanted a clear answer. The red which began to recite softly, using the ancient tongue of Ashai while focusing all her attention on the fire. First nothing happened, but then the pain came. A dry throb drove itself behind her eyes, followed by another, stronger one, and soon she felt something warm beginning to run over her upper lip. Blood flowed from her nose, then from her eyes, and finally from her ears, but Melisandre did not stop, clenching her teeth as she forced the connection while the pain spread throughout her head. The fire began to distort before her and, little by little, the stone, the heat, and the brazier itself began to disappear. For a moment she felt as though she were falling, and when she opened her eyes again she was no longer on Dragonstone. A void surrounded her completely, and for several seconds she saw nothing but darkness, until little by little she began to make out a figure in front of her. It was herself. Melisandre saw herself from the outside, as though she were watching a scene that did not belong to her. She was chained, with her wrists and ankles bound by black shackles covered in glowing runes written in a language she did not recognize. Her robe had been reduced to a blackened rag stained with ash and sweat, while the air of the cell tasted of smoke and dampness. Then the door burst open. The footsteps were heard before the figure appeared, slow, clear, and rhythmic, until a shadow fell across the bars of the cell. He was tall, broad, and wide-shouldered, with blonde hair falling over his back and a dark cloak resting on his shoulders. Vlad entered without haste and stopped a short distance away, sitting down on an old wooden chair while observing the Red Witch in silence. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes did. The golden irises were still beautiful, almost hypnotic, but all that beauty was twisted by a rage so intense it seemed impossible to conceal. A cold, deep, silent fury that made that gaze something far more unsettling than a shout or a threat. "I should congratulate you," Vlad said calmly, leaning back in the chair as he watched her from the other side of the cell. "I do not know what ritual you used, but you have hidden it well from me and mine. That deserves some credit." Melisandre barely lifted her head. "The credit is not mine," she replied in a faint voice. "It belongs to the Lord of Light. I am only his instrument." Vlad let out a faint smile, though there was no trace of humor in it. "Even so, the effort is admirable," he remarked as he rested one arm on the back of the chair. "But I will find it eventually, or in the end you will tell me where it is. You could spare yourself the pain and tell me what I want to know." Melisandre held his gaze without looking away. "There is no pain in this world that would make me betray the Lord of Light," she said with determination. "They all say the same thing," Vlad replied without raising his voice, "until the pain begins." She did not waver. "You do not understand," she said with quiet firmness. "He is our only hope. I cannot let you kill him." Vlad's laughter echoed through the cell, cold, dry, and completely devoid of humor. "Is this love, Red Witch?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, as though the idea amused him. "Love is for children," she answered, barely lifting her head to hold his gaze despite the exhaustion and the chains. "I have a blood debt to him." Vlad slowly rose from the chair and began to walk toward the bars of the cell without taking his eyes off her. "Tell me," he asked with apparent curiosity, as though he truly wanted to understand her. "I made a pact with him," Melisandre said, slightly tightening her fingers around the chains hanging from her wrists. "I swore to protect him as much as I could, so I hid him from you and yours. In return, he will fulfill his destiny and save humanity." This time Vlad laughed openly, as though what he had just heard struck him as absurd. "And what would you do if I promised to spare his life?" he asked as he stopped in front of the bars, wearing a charming smile that never reached his eyes. Melisandre slowly shook her head, and when she looked at him again there was a cold firmness in her eyes. "I am not going to help you," she said calmly, without looking away from him despite the chains and exhaustion. "You can be sure of that." Vlad remained standing before her, watching her from very close, and all amusement disappeared from his face. "The realm hangs by a thread and you bargain with the life of one man," he commented with a cruel smile. "Realms rise and fall. It is not something that concerns me," she replied, barely shrugging despite the chains. "I was a slave." "And what are you now?" Vlad asked, tilting his head slightly with an interest that seemed feigned. Melisandre lowered her gaze for a moment toward the stone floor before lifting it again. "It is not that difficult. I have a blood debt to him," she finally said in a lower voice, "and it is my duty to repay it." Vlad watched her in silence for a few seconds. "And will you be able to?" he finally asked as his voice began to harden. "Will you be able to repay so much blood? The burning of the temple? The sacrifice of the orphans? Little Milani, Kinvara told me about your past." Melisandre went completely still. The color drained from her face and her lips parted slightly, as though she had forgotten how to breathe. Her eyes widened, and the certainty she had maintained until that moment shattered all at once. She felt her heart tighten, and a pain she had thought buried in the depths of her mind forced its way back through her as though it had never healed. But more than the pain, what tormented her was the guilt. A constant guilt that drilled into her chest and numbed her senses. A guilt that had never entirely disappeared no matter how much she had tried to bury it beneath prayers, sacrifices, and promises. "Not even your Lord of Light could tear that guilt out of you, could he?" Vlad continued, staring at her while giving her a look of disgust. "Because no matter how much you pray, you still see her face when you close your eyes. You failed her, did you not?" Her eyes slowly began to fill with tears, and she had to look away from Vlad, unable to keep meeting his gaze while feeling all that guilt crushing her again. "You do not have a blood debt," Vlad said, stepping closer to the bars while anger began to show in his voice. "Your debt bleeds red, and you think saving a man not much more virtuous than yourself will change anything? It is the lowest sort of sentimentality. You are like a child, praying. Pathetic." With each word his voice grew deeper and more monstrous, until it sounded like the restrained growl of a beast. "You lie and curse, hiding behind your God like someone washing their hands," Vlad continued, taking another step toward her while the anger in his voice kept growing. "You pretend to have a code that compensates for the countless horrors you have committed, but they are part of you and you will never erase them." Tears began to gather in Melisandre's eyes. She tried to grit her teeth and hold his gaze, but every word seemed to sink a little deeper into her, stirring guilt and memories she had spent years trying to keep buried. Then Vlad moved, so quickly that Melisandre could not even follow him with her eyes. He passed through the thick steel bars as though they were dry branches and grabbed her by the throat with one hand, lifting her from the ground while the chains rattled violently. Melisandre let out a strangled sound and instinctively grabbed at Vlad's wrist, trying to pull it away without managing to move it even an inch. "I am not going to kill him," Vlad declared, the rage now fully overflowing in his voice as he held her suspended in the air. "Not until I force him to kill you. Slowly, intimately, in every way I know you fear. And then I will free him so he can see his great work, and, when he screams, I will crush his skull." The more Vlad spoke, the harder it became for Melisandre to breathe, to the point that she no longer knew whether she lacked air because of the pressure of that hand around her throat or because of terror. Vlad suddenly let her go and Melisandre crashed to the ground, coughing as she tried to catch her breath, and tears began to slide down her cheeks. Vlad looked down at her for a moment, with nothing but disgust in his gaze. "This is my offer to you, weeping whore," he said contemptuously, spitting out the words. Melisandre looked up at him, completely frozen by horror, her face wet, her breathing unsteady, and her chest rising and falling rapidly as she tried to hold back tears she could no longer hide. "You are a monster," she said in a faint voice, looking away. "Yes," Vlad replied before turning around and walking toward the exit of the cell. "But this world does not need a hero, it needs a monster." The door closed behind him. For several seconds Melisandre remained there, kneeling on the stone floor, trembling, her face wet and her breathing broken. Then the cell began to distort. The bars bent in on themselves, the walls cracked, and Vlad's figure began to disappear into shadows, as though all of it were being dragged toward some place far deeper and darker. Melisandre felt an unbearable pain tearing through her head. The smoke, the cold of the stone, and the sound of the chains vanished all at once, replaced by the suffocating heat of the chamber on Dragonstone. She opened her eyes with a gasp. Blood was still running from her nose, eyes and ears, and for several seconds she could barely breathe as she pressed a trembling hand against her chest. Then the pain finally overtook her, the red which collapsed to one side and fell unconscious onto the stone floor. Chapter 100, Chapter 97. Toward Pike. 97, p. Casterly Rock. Several weeks had already passed since the fall of Casterly Rock, and the black dragon banners flew above its towers. That, along with Drakel's distant roar, was enough to maintain calm among the vassals. Vlad had made it clear from the beginning that his rule would be fair, but ruthless toward any attempt to cause unrest. He did not expect loyalty from a newly conquered fortress, but he did expect order and obedience. Fortunately for him, most understood that quickly. The peasants worked as before, the merchants continued opening their stalls, and the nobles learned to stay out of the way whenever they could. In fact, even the few Lannisters who remained, mostly women and children, still lived within the fortress without incident, because despite everything, no one inside the fortress went hungry and no one was punished without reason. The news coming from the west was similar, as several minor houses had accepted the new ruler without resistance, and Kevin Lannister himself handled the negotiations, persuaded gently by the small detail that the rest of his family still remained inside the fortress. He traveled from castle to convince his peers, and the dark circles beneath his eyes, his slumped shoulders, and his exhausted face were enough to send the message. The new Lord of the West did not negotiate. In the great hall of Casterly Rock, Vlad listened to his advisors while the fire from the torches reflected across the stone tiles and the map of the West occupied much of the table before him, covered with markings indicating subdued castles, trade routes, and villages. Ser Barristan, rejuvenated by the dark gift, stood at his right with his arms crossed over his chest, and his bearing was even more imposing now that he seemed to have regained 30 years of life, while Jorah Mormont, serious and silent, leaned against one of the nearby columns, studying the map. "We have received reports of small raids from the Iron Islands against several coastal villages." Jorah informed them as he moved a wooden piece across the map. They plundered 2 villages and withdrew back to sea. Vlad lowered his gaze toward the markers placed along the western coast and remained silent for a few moments, tracing the line of the sea with one finger until it reached Pike. He almost smiled at his good fortune. He had spent some time considering how to destroy the Iron Islands without provoking resentment among the people. He did not need an excuse, in truth he had never needed one, but the fact that the Ironborn themselves had handed him the casus belli on a silver platter was almost poetic justice. He could ravage the islands, exterminate their bloodline, destroy their fortresses, and do it not only without losing reputation, but while being praised for it. At last he raised his gaze. "Then the time has come," he said at last. "When my queen returns, we will finally be crowned as rulers of these lands, and shortly afterward the Black Fleet will depart for the Iron Islands to establish a naval blockade and isolate them." Jorah looked up. "And after that?" he asked with excitement. As a former inhabitant of Bear Island, Jorah had encountered the Ironborn more than once over the years. Vlad turned his head slightly toward Barristan. "After that, Daenerys and I will go to Pike," he said calmly, "and we will utterly destroy the island." Barristan held his gaze for a moment. "Do we expect resistance?" he asked with some concern. "Not at all," Vlad replied as he turned his attention back to the map. "The Ironborn trust too much in their reputation. They neither believe nor expect that anyone would dare attack them in their own lands, and even less have they prepared contingencies." His finger stopped over Pike. "It would be a massacre, yes, but the Iron Islands deserved nothing better." The conversation continued for several more minutes. They spoke about ports, ships, and the supplies needed to reinforce the fleet before moving it. It was then that a young soldier entered the hall in a hurry. His breathing was uneven, and raindrops still clung to his shoulders. He bowed immediately. "Your Majesty, a ship is approaching the harbor," he said, trying to catch his breath. "It carries 2 banners, the Black Dragon and the Red Dragon." The room fell silent. Vlad did not seem surprised. He simply remained seated in his chair, his gaze fixed on the map and lost in thought. Of course he knew she was coming. It was always the same whenever Daenerys was near. There was something about her, about the bond they shared, that Vlad could barely describe. It was a strange calm, a pleasant and familiar sensation that surfaced whenever she was close. It was almost as if their hearts eventually harmonized. But warmth and tranquility were not the only things he could feel as she drew nearer. At last he looked up. "Then prepare yourselves to receive the Queen," he said with a smile. Hours later, as the sky began to darken over Casterly Rock and the torches once again illuminated the stone corridors, the great doors of the hall opened once more. Those present already knew who had arrived at the castle and, even so, the atmosphere remained strange. Vlad sat upon the throne, one arm resting on the armrest and his gaze fixed ahead. Normally, he would have gone out to receive her the moment the ship arrived at the harbor. But he had not. Then the doors opened completely. Daenerys entered accompanied by Myrcella Baratheon and Missandei. Her expression was serious, her steps firm, and some of the dampness from the journey still clung to her clothes and hair. Missandei walked half a step behind her, her hands clasped before her body, while Myrcella looked around with curiosity. Vlad watched her walk down the central aisle without taking his eyes off her for a single moment. The faint sensation that accompanied their bond could now be felt clearly. When Daenerys stopped in front of the throne, Vlad finally rose and descended the steps one by one. When Vlad stood before Daenerys, she looked up at him. She had expected a smile, a question, or perhaps a reproach for her delay, but Vlad remained silent for several seconds, observing her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. His eyes dropped for a brief moment toward her belly before meeting hers again. "Tell me, princess, what do you know about vampire anatomy?" he asked in a calm voice, with his usual rough and masculine tone. She looked at him, confused by the question, and opened her mouth to answer, but he continued before giving her the chance. "We are larger and taller, of course," he said in an almost casual tone. "Our hearts are proportionally larger." Daenerys blinked, unsure whether she should answer, but something in Vlad's tone caused a faint blush to spread across her cheeks. "Really?" she asked, trying to change the subject. But Vlad stepped closer to her. "Our vision is superior to that of humans," he added in his rough voice as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, "and our sense of smell." Their eyes met, and Daenerys felt the heat rise even more to her face. Vlad leaned slightly toward her, bringing his lips close to her ear. "I can smell you, little princess," he whispered in a low, slow voice, "and I am thinking about drinking the sweet nectar you are making for me." Daenerys was left breathless as she felt her insides turn into a fountain. Of course, she was especially excited to reunite with her husband after several weeks, but she had not expected it to be so obvious to him. Vlad placed a hand on Daenerys's waist and pulled her firmly against him. "Straight from the fucking cup," he murmured, looking directly into her eyes. Daenerys barely had time to take a breath when Vlad picked her up in his arms, and the two of them disappeared in a blur so fast that the marble floor cracked beneath their feet. For several seconds, no one said anything. Yora let out a slow breath and ran a hand over his face. Barristan shook his head, tired, though a faint smile eventually appeared on his face. "We should give them privacy," he finally said. Several nodded before leaving the hall. The pair of rulers refused to receive visitors for 2 entire days, enjoying their reunion and dedicating their time exclusively to matters of state. Myrcella Baratheon, who had arrived alongside Daenerys, did not know whether to feel more surprised by the state of her ancestral home or by the appearance of the Impaler Lord himself. If she had truly been as naive as she appeared, she would have fallen hopelessly in love, because merely being in his presence was enough to make her feel flustered and experience the absurd urge to laugh at anything he said. Fortunately, her mind was strong and quicker than her body, so she quickly understood that she needed to control herself, unless she wanted a pretty mark on her face to match Aryan Martell's. But what surprised her most were the 4 giant dragons flying above the castle, who from time to time descended to lie across the fields and receive affection from their parents. Myrcella understood that, while money and armies were important in war, they were irrelevant in the face of creatures like those, so at least she could be glad to be on the winning side. And the best part was that Vlad had finally begun to move like a true player in the Game of Thrones, though he would do it in the only way that guaranteed victory, by overturning the board itself. Destroying the Iron Islands was only a small step. In practice, the territory was not especially important. Yes, it possessed a respectable military force, but unless they were desperate, no noble house in Westeros would willingly ally itself with them, because anyone foolish enough to do so could only expect betrayal. With the Ironborn, the question was never whether they would betray you, but when. Now, on the day of the coronation, Myrcella watched in silence as servants crossed the halls decorated with the Black Dragon banner. She had spent the past days walking through the castle and trying to understand the situation of what little family she had left, doing what she did best, staying silent and observing. But there was really nothing that could concern her, because her few living relatives were living extremely well by the standards of captured nobles, something she silently thanked Vlad for. As she thought to herself, she saw Missandei, whom she had come to know during the voyage, giving orders with a seriousness that Myrcella found almost comical. She had met her alongside Daenerys and had found her cheerful and lively, though intensely loyal to her queen. However, the contrast between that warmth and the authority with which she addressed others was striking. She did not shout, yet everyone obeyed her down to the smallest detail. It was obvious that, in this new order, authority did not come from title but from loyalty. Farther ahead, in the inner courtyard, Myrcella met Ser Barristan's gaze. His figure stood firm and, for a moment, she doubted whether he was truly the same old man she remembered from King's Landing. Time itself seemed to have moved backward, leaving only a man of 40 and the feeling of standing before a wild beast. Near the main entrance, she saw her Uncle Kevin organizing the nobles of the castle and his own family. They were all dressed in their finest clothes, and the women were telling the children to smile and applaud. Despite his attire, Kevin seemed to have aged in only a few weeks. Myrcella understood that her uncle had accepted a bitter truth. The Lannisters had lost all their power, and resistance would only bring more suffering. When the bells began to ring, silence descended over the fortress. Daenerys and Vlad walked together down the central aisle, escorted by rows of soldiers in black armor and crimson cloaks. She wore a black mantle with the emblem of the 3 dragons embroidered in red thread, and he wore an outfit of the same color with silver details and his own banner engraved across the chest. Ser Barristan stepped forward and, in a solemn voice, proclaimed as he placed a reddish Valyrian steel crown upon Vlad's head. "Before you stands Vlad Drackle of houses Drackle and Targaryen," he declared, his tone filled with pride, "the first of his name, King of the Undulls, the Royner, and the First Men, King of the 7 Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm, Great Khal of the East, the Red Stallion, Father of Dragons, Breaker of Chains, and the Impaler Lord." The nobles applauded and the soldiers struck their spears against the floor in a unified thunder. Vlad and Daenerys sat upon the double throne, a new creation built from the stone of the rock itself. She took a deep breath and, for an instant, her composure broke, a single tear of blood running down her cheek while her eyes drifted toward the western windows, finally looking upon her dream fulfilled of returning to the land of her family. Though much still remained to be done, she was satisfied. Vlad also looked toward the horizon, watching the sun set as he contemplated everything he had achieved almost 4 years after awakening in that field in the Sea of Grass. And with a faint smile, he repeated the same words he had told himself then, at the beginning of his journey. "Maximum effort," he murmured softly, without taking his eyes off the horizon.